Good morning, everyone. Dear participants, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Working Session 8 on Tolerance and Non-Discrimination, dealing with the rights of persons belonging to national minorities and preventing aggressive nationalism, racism and chauvinism. My name is William Romans. I work as a senior legal advisor to the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, Ambassador Zanier. I've been with the organization about 6 years, and this is my fourth HDIM. It's my privilege to be your moderator this morning. All participating states have affirmed that respect for rights of the persons belonging to national minorities as part of a universal human rights commitments, and have recognized that this is an essential factor for peace, justice, stability, and democracy. In this session, we will address both positive practices and also the challenges faced in designing and implementing integration strategies that ensure protection and promotion of the rights of persons belonging to national minorities. The questions which you may further focus upon are listed in the annotated agenda, and I would kindly refer you there, and later on in this session, if necessary, we can remind ourselves of the issues on which we are to focus. This is an area in which the High Commissioner works very closely together with participating states on a regular basis, and we know many of you here today and have good working relationships with you. Pursuant to the relevant decision, either the High Commissioner or his senior representative should address you at this session. This morning, that privilege falls to our director, Mr. Henrik Verladsen. Henrik?
Thank you very much, William. Good morning, everybody. As William said, my name is Henrik Verladsen. I'm the director at the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities and am thus representing the institution today. I bring you also best regards from the High Commissioner himself, who, after attending the opening of this event last Monday, traveled directly to Ukraine, where he has been visiting several parts of the country during the week, and where he is having meetings with the government in Kiev this morning. I want to thank the chairmanship, and I want to thank ODIHR for giving the High Commissioner on National Minority yet again this year the opportunity to take part in this very important event in the OSCE calendar. Personally, I have taken part in these events for the last 4 years. My mandate will be expiring later in the year, so this is the last time I'll be at this forum in this capacity. And as always, I'm very much looking forward to the discussions that will unfold during the day. Just a few words about the institution of the High Commissioner on National Minorities. Strictly speaking, as you will know, the High Commissioner on National Minorities is not a human dimension instrument, but it's an instrument that belongs in the political security dimension of the OSCE as one of the main conflict prevention instruments. But let me stress, and I cannot stress that enough, that the OSCE human dimension commitments underpins all the work we do at the High Commissioner of national minorities, and therefore we are always extremely grateful and interested in attending this event. I have high expectations to the next few hours, as we have been very blessed, I would say, by having two extraordinarily interesting speakers with whom that we work very closely. I'll give the word back to William to, among other things, introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrik. As you said, we have two exceptional speakers today for you. We have Dr. Petra Rotter. We have Dr. Petra Rotter and Professor Fernand de Varenne, both internationally recognized experts on the rights of persons belonging to national minorities. And they both also work very closely with our office in Professor de Varen's situation going back 20 years. May I first introduce Dr. Petra Rotter, who is Associate Professor of International Relations at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of Ljubljana, and until very recently, President of the Council of Europe Advisory Committee on the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. For those of you who are not aware, that's the leading monitoring mechanism within the Council of Europe for those states which have ratified the Framework Convention. The High Commissioner enjoys close collaboration with her in many areas, and we're very happy that she's agreed to join us and speak today. Dr. Rotter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much also to the High Commissioner and the Office for the invitation to be able to share a few thoughts with this distinguished audience. I will seek to briefly outline three, among several others, worrying trends that set the tone towards national minorities and persons belonging to them, but also towards minority-related policies. They all pose obstacles to effective access to minority rights and thus also to successful societal integration, and can ultimately endanger peace in the region. So they are all relevant for the discussion today. The first general trend is a strengthened perception of minorities and persons belonging to them as a problem, as problematic. This perception, the so-called minority problem in inverted commas, is not a new phenomenon. In fact, history of the international community has been determined by the processes of nation building and state formation based on nationalism, promotion of a dominant community, and purity, homogeneity. All these despite diversity as a natural feature of all societies. Also today, and yet diversity is politically instrumentalized as a problem, and persons belonging to minorities as the other, that is described as threatening our culture, our language, our religion, or just our way of life, and our community, defined narrowly in monoethnic sense. This perception of minorities and persons belonging to them is phrased also in security terms, whereby others endanger not just our human security, but also security of our state. Aggressive nationalism further exacerbates these perceptions. The addressees of the perception at the center of the so-called minority problem vary in place and over time. It can be persons belonging to national minorities settled in a territory of a state for centuries, or those who belong to more recently formed minority communities. It can be those who speak a different first language, or those who belong to a different religious denomination, those who dress differently, or have a different skin tone. Worryingly, these perceptions have found resonance among individuals who deem it legitimate to take things into their own hands and act contrary to any commonly agreed norms and shared values, contrary to basic human rights. Hate speech and hate crimes are on the rise, so are extreme populism, exclusive nationalism, and a number of other isms that have always been so damaging for humanity, but also for the regimes that promoted them. History should serve as a prominent reminder when we assess the developments today. The second trend I wish to draw attention to is related with skepticism or even open opposition to multilateralism. It may be very popular to argue that multilateral institutions are obsolete, they do not serve specific interests of individual states, or even that they promote wrong international norms and values. However, we should all remind ourselves that political international institutions are a phenomenon in existence for less than a century, as a major step forward towards addressing the most difficult issues jointly. Of course, it has never been easy to agree on common normative grounds, but issues are so interlinked and transnational that states knew that the only way to address them and for all of them to be better off was through international institutions, multilaterally, jointly, as part of their common international concern. Multilateralism in the field of minority rights as a joint effort to prevent discrimination and secure access to minority rights to ensure effective equality is needed now, perhaps more than ever. History should have taught us that selective instruments after World War I or ignorance of specific minority rights right after World War II were not satisfactory. The international regime we have today is a major achievement. It is based on a wise recognition that minority issues are a matter of international concern and require universal norms. Importantly, it is not access to minority rights and equality that undermines peace and stability. It is not too many rights for too many individuals that will lead to problems and societal disintegration. Rather, discrimination, inequality, and negative attitudes towards persons belonging to national minorities are a guarantee for social disintegration. States need to understand this and work jointly to avoid this scenario. Access to minority rights has to be guaranteed to all persons belonging to national minorities, regardless of the state in which they live, or regardless of particular interests of another state, typically a neighboring one. This brings me to the third and last trend I would like to highlight: increasing bilateralization of minority rights. This increasing interest to deal with minority issues bilaterally, combined with the previously mentioned trend of moving away from multilateralism, is alarming. This is not to suggest, of course, that bilateral agreements on good neighborly relations are obsolete. On the contrary, but one can note that many states seem to be more concerned about their kin minorities living abroad, and they spend more money on them, than about their own citizens, persons belonging to their own minorities. In fact, even in terminological sense, there is often a confusion that sounds around the wrong message about who's ours and who's not. This increased bilateralization is often felt in the work of independent supervisory mechanisms that are able to detect problematic trends and offer impartial comparative advice on how best to address problems before they escalate. Their recommendations are being redrafted in line with daily political interests of typically two concerned states, which often puts additional burden on their bilateral relations. Furthermore, it denies persons belonging to national minorities actorness. They become objects whose interests and needs are decided by others, the so-called kin states, rather than by themselves. This also means that intra-group diversity is not taken into account. Special needs of minority women, children, the elderly, or those living in rural areas are completely ignored. Effective participation in decision-making is thus not guaranteed. It should be stressed that when states have an interest in the well-being of persons belonging to national minorities elsewhere, any policy or action towards helping those persons should be in line with the High Commissioner's Bolzano-Bozen recommendations on national minorities and interstate relations. They are now 10 years old and just as relevant, if not even more, than a decade ago. Bilateralization is worrying also as it opens up the doors for foreign interests, possibly interference in internal affairs. It can lead to mistrust and thus the strengthening of minorities being seen as a problem. And importantly, this tutelage system leaves out persons belonging to minorities that do not have the so-called kin state, with the Roma, of course, being the most numerous one. All these requests intensive efforts from all of us, including politicians, community leaders, scholars, the media, and the general public, as well as international institutions, in forums such as this, to address the ongoing social conflicts where national minorities and persons belonging to them are perceived as a problem, just because they are different. Our joint efforts should be directed towards integration of society. Mind the terminology, not integration into, but of society, as the Ljubljana Guidelines on Integration of Diverse Societies issued by the High Commissioner suggest, as a two-way and an all-encompassing process that should lead to a situation where persons belonging to minorities are recognized not as a problem, but as an equal and valued part of our diverse societies. I very much look forward to the discussion later on and would like to thank you all for your attention.
Petra, thank you very much. Petra has been working at the forefront of this field for the last few years and absolutely speaks from a position of authority on this subject. Our next speaker, Professor Fernand de Varenne, is Extraordinary Professor at the University of Pretoria, Visiting Professor at the National University of Ireland, Galway, and Visiting Professor at the University of Hong Kong. Safe to say that he is renowned as one of the world's leading experts in this area, no doubt leading to his recent appointment as the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues. Professor de Varenne first worked with the HCNM institution over 20 years ago, and we're very happy that this collaboration continues. Fernand, the floor is yours.
Thank you, William. Distingués invités et collègues, mesdames et messieurs.
Distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning.
The two first words of this and other sessions: tolerance and non-discrimination. Around the world, what I'm seeing are symptoms of a malaise that go directly to the heart of the whole human rights architecture that has emerged after the Second World War. And in this, I include, of course, in Europe, the Oslo recommendations regarding the linguistic rights of national minorities, the Hague recommendations regarding the education rights of national minorities, as well as the United Nations Declaration on the rights of persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious, and linguistic minorities at the global level. Now, I would summarize this identification of a malaise by pointing out four phenomena. There's a growing dismissal, erosion, and even rejection of human rights internationally, particularly for those, in relation to those who are deemed, well, unworthy, unqualified, or just plain unpopular. Secondly, persons belonging to certain minorities can find themselves at the receiving end as, well, let's admit it, convenient scapegoats politically, as lightning rods for growing fears, intolerance, and even paranoia amid the uncertainties of a world which, to many, appears as unresponsive or increasingly threatening. Thirdly, the denial of the human rights of minorities, including by discrimination in areas such as citizenship, use of language in education and other areas, or restrictions linked to their religions or belief, can contribute to tensions, frustrations, or even and feelings of alienation and exclusion. And fourth, stability. Stability in many states is directly affected by these trends, to the point where most of the world's conflicts today, and this is not controversial, most of the world's conflicts today are linked to long-standing grievances around mounting intolerance and denial of the human rights of groups such as specific minorities. And I would like to mention a couple of examples to illustrate these trends. As you may know, more than 3/4 of the world's 10 million or so stateless persons are individuals who belong to minorities. And it's not a coincidence. In many parts of the world, specific minorities find themselves at the receiving end of attitudes and policies, for historical and other reasons, that target them specifically as not deserving citizenship. And as many of you also know, there is currently a global campaign with the United Nations High Commissioner of Refugees, the I Belong campaign, to eradicate statelessness by 2024. Well, we may in fact be facing an increase, not an eradication, in the total number of stateless individuals by next year, halfway through the campaign to eradicate this challenge, because of policies in two countries that particular impact on specific linguistic and religious minorities, so that we may in fact be increasing by more than 2 or 3 million people who may become stateless in the next year. We're not eradicating this problem because of policies that are connected to exclusion, and I would say discrimination. We are in fact increasing the number of individuals who are marginalized and vulnerable. The second illustration is the first joint effort by the United Nations and the World Bank in a study that was just released this year called Pathways for Peace, Inclusive Approaches to Preventing Violent Conflict. When this study points out that today's main drivers of instability within many states, instability and conflict are group-based grievances around exclusion. And I would suggest the denial of the human rights of minorities in many cases. Now, even though the details are somewhat coded into, well, more diplomatic or acceptable language, what this study indicates is that peace, stability, and justice are directly entwined, and that they require addressing the core human rights basis for these grievances, grievances associated with the economic, political, or social exclusion and human rights breaches of groups. That's the term they use in this study, but groups quite often being, in fact, minorities in many countries. These grievances, these claims of denial of equality and justice are not demands for special rights. They're usually grievances that fundamental human rights such as equality and non-discrimination are not being respected. And this leads to a situation of exclusion, injustice, and eventually, unfortunately, tensions that could become violent. What can be done? What can be done internationally? We need to go back to the basics. The rights of minorities are human rights, as my colleague has mentioned previously, and that's worth repeating. When we talk about the rights of minorities, when we talk about how do we achieve tolerance, how do we address chauvinism, racism, we have to always keep in mind that we are talking about actually respecting, recognizing, and implementing the human rights of minorities. I think there needs to be a recommitment to what is central to tolerance and non-discrimination. The human rights architecture, which were morally propelled as a reaction to the horrors of the Holocaust and its genocidal impulses last century, have to be recognized, recommitted, and we have to strengthen the mechanisms, the architecture, and the acceptance of international human rights obligations, which seems to be, in fact, not being beyond lip service, not being followed as much or as much commitment as perhaps they should. Too many seem to have lost their way and only give lip service, implementing sometimes in arbitrary ways or turning a blind eye to mounting chauvinism, turning a blind eye to the vision and mission that emerged in the very first paragraphs, the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights some 70 years ago in 1958. And that is that the way to peace and stability runs through justice and dignity, where human rights standards and obligations are central, universal standards. There is, and this is a form of conclusion, and a challenge also, there is often a growing erosion, a tendency of denying the universal inherent nature of the human rights of minorities, or by attaching conditionalities to their exercise. Hate speech against certain minorities is increasing, not everywhere, not in every situation or country, but in too many parts of the world, we are seeing an increase of hate speech, and quite often hate speech tends to be directed against certain minorities. And yet, we are seeing sometimes what seems to be a hesitancy or an unwillingness to tackle it forcibly. Some practices, even among international organizations, seems to suggest that some minorities are not entitled to the full panoply of human rights protection, of respect and acceptance of our shared common humanity, sometimes by suggesting or claiming or adopting the approach that they are not citizens anyway, or that they are not loyal, or that they are not sufficiently integrated. This is not helpful. This is not healthy. In fact, this can be dangerous. And it has to be countermanded by governmental and non-governmental organizations and societies, by them recommitting and ensuring that the human rights standards, obligations, are a red line that cannot be set aside or diluted. We have too many sacrifices, too many people around the world. And in my work, I see this in Africa, in Asia, in other parts of the world also. Individuals have sacrificed their lives so that this architecture, which emerged after the Second World War, is fully recognized. It's a red line that we cannot forget. And this, I would suggest to you, is particularly true of minorities who may, not always, but often be among the most vulnerable, the most marginalized, or at the receiving end of racism, intolerance, and rejection in too many of our countries. So I'm looking forward to engaging with some of you later on these and other points, and I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fernand. It's really great that we have the benefit of your participation today, and I hope that we will have the opportunity to come back to you later. Okay, so I have some announcements to run through to ensure that our time together is productive as possible. The speakers list is already full with 50 registered speakers as well as a reserve list, so the list is now closed. Please take the floor only in the capacity and under the name which you are registered. Please respect the seating arrangements according to the signs which have been placed around the room, and we will be strict on this today. The session will be live streamed, so as we tell our children, once it's on the internet, it never really goes away. In the interests of a genuine discussion, we encourage that you do not read from pre-prepared statements, although since this is HDIM and we're realists, if you do have a pre-prepared statement, please make it available to the interpreters. Documents can also be distributed under the aptly named Documents Distribution System. Filming and photography is permitted only by accredited journalists, and we will ask anyone to stop if this happens otherwise. As your moderator, I aim to ensure that this session is conducted in an orderly and respectful manner to each other. Criticism is absolutely acceptable, but I would appreciate if you could assist me to keep the tone constructive. If there are points of order, I will accept them immediately, but please do not speak on the substance of the matter under discussion. As we have a very full speakers list, speakers' time will be limited to 2.5 minutes, and we may have to reduce this further if there are any interruptions. Okay, so I will hold you strictly to this limit, and I look forward to a constructive discussion. Are we ready with the timer? Okay, so I declare this open, and the floor to our first speaker.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to briefly address the issue of linguistic rights for national minorities in Romania, which is one of the main areas of focus of our organization. Several aspects regarding the use of minority languages in the public administration and also within the judicial system continue to negatively affect persons belonging to national minorities, giving way to discrimination, as signaled in 2 reports on Romania released at the beginning of this year by the Council of Europe. The legislative framework on linguistic rights for national minorities is by no means coherent. Various provisions are spread across a range of laws, there being no comprehensive law on minority language use. Moreover, while laws are generally permissive, concrete norms aimed at implementation, monitoring, and follow-up are often lacking. There is a general lack of accountability when it comes to enforcing legal provisions regarding minority rights, which needs to be addressed. Recent years, but especially the last 2 years, have been marked by so far failed attempts to update linguistic rights for national minorities in Romania. One such initiative was blocked in Parliament last year, while another, a new administrative code containing several much-needed provisions that relate to the use of minority languages, is currently under review by the Constitutional Court after being contested by the Office of the President. These are not singular cases. There seems to be a systematic refusal to update linguistic rights in Romania, which has the potential of further eroding the trust between minority communities and the state. The Romanian state needs to commit to a more comprehensive approach, as well as to show an increased willingness to facilitate the broader usage of linguistic and minority rights within a legislative framework that also specifies concrete measures for implementation, as well as allocating adequate funding for this. A generally permissive legal context means nothing without actual positive measures taken by the state to ensure proper implementation. International organizations can also play an essential role in this by overseeing the entire process of implementing minority and linguistic rights, starting with clear and comprehensive legislation, but also making sure that the states allocate the necessary human and financial resources to these projects so that the costs are ultimately not borne by the individuals whose rights the state is supposed to ensure and protect. Thank you.
Thank you very much as well for sticking within the time limits and setting a good example. Now I would go to the next speaker, the European Federation. The floor is yours. Do we have the European Federation here in the room? Okay, in that case we will, okay.
FECRIS and the European Association of Defense of Victims of Undue Influence by Abusive Groups are often targeted by smear campaigns insisting on the alleged threat against religious freedom they represent. FECRIS is an NGO with participatory status with the Council of Europe since 2005. The same people accusing FECRIS of being freedom destroyer activists have fought against our organizations using unfair means to prevent the granting of our status. Several well-informed journalists reported these facts. The Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, with record 1697, stated the allegations against FECRIS were not justified. The participatory status of FECRIS has been renewed, as has been the special ECOSOC status with the United Nations, proves of their confidence. The same group of people is carrying on defamation campaigns against our organization within these institutions and the European Union, which FECRIS represented. Such accusations are made by organizations sometimes in collusion with very controversial causes, and the paradox lies there. Is denouncing closed groups, be they religious, for having committed abuse on children and infringement of freedom of belief? To denounce the attacks on freedom of conscience made by such groups towards individuals, is that undermining beliefs? It is the criminal practices of these groups that FECRIS denounces in the democratic countries, because these practices harm not only citizens, but through them the fundamental principles underlying democracy. Once again, FECRIS asks the representatives of the governments that make up this honorable assembly not to be mistaken in their judgment, and attracts your institution's attention on the justification of the fight that FECRIS is waging. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And now I hand the floor to the next organization, Public Organization Crimea SOS. The floor is yours.
Good morning. I represent the Crimean human rights organization that deals with human rights violations in Crimea. I'm going to talk about linguistic rights. After Crime's occupation by the Russian Federation, Russia introduced a so-called constitution of the Republic of Crimea, which states that there are 3 official state languages in Crimea: Russian, Ukrainian, and the Crimean Tatar language. The state government is the language that all of the documents and legislative frameworks should be used, and used in education and in schools, and information for the public. The legislative framework in Crimea is only in the Russian language, Any state site is also in Russian. Complaints can be presented in the Crimean Tatar language, but the legislative framework is only in Russian. Now, on education, on paper, Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar languages can be voluntarily taught or learned, and there are schools that use these two languages. But the number of these schools is constantly dropping. 50 schools that use Crimean Tatar, but in fact, they only use Russian. There's only one school where the Ukrainian is used, but really only Russian is used. Textbooks in Ukrainian aren't published at all. Crimean Tatar language has 14 subjects and 1,000 textbooks, but that is for over 3,000 students who need that language. In chemistry and physics, for example, there are no textbooks in the Crimean Tatar language. In the general high school tests, one cannot use those languages in these exams, and many schools are now being closed that used to use Crimean Tatar language. The administration is using excuses and are hindering efforts of parents and the public to have access to education in the Crimean Tatar language and to study that literature. As recommendations go, we would like to suggest that we should put pressure on the Russian Federation with regard to linguistic rights, and also to stop the destruction of the Crimean population, national minorities, and the castle in that region. Thank you.
And I'd like to hand to the next organization. Thank you. The floor is yours.
I welcome all of those who are here in the hall today. First of all, I'd like to thank you for having given me the opportunity to speak. In Crimea, ensuring the rights of national minorities is important. I am a Crimean Tatar. My husband and my sons are political prisoners. He has been falsely accused of horrible acts, but in fact he is being persecuted for the fact that he thinks differently and that he is active in civil society. People are suffering only because they have not agreed to cooperate. Unfortunately, not only my family is suffering, but hundreds of Crimean Tatar families are suffering. Distinguished delegates, I have come to you to tell you about our pain. My son was, in fact, freed and then came to you. A year later, he found himself in prison again, and he was ill. He, in fact, was pronounced clinically dead. The fact is that my son, for 3.5 years, has done everything possible to demonstrate that he is not guilty of the charges against him. I don't know how we'll find the strength to do so, but we will continue to fight. And my family and all the family of political prisoners need your support. Thank you.
Thank you. We appreciate your contribution. Now I move on to the next speaker. International Partnership for Human Rights. The floor is yours.
Good morning, participants of NGOs. My name is Omira Bargimov. I came from Bakhshir from Crimea. I am only speaking here for one reason, and that is that my son in May of 2016 was kidnapped. It was in May of 2016. My son was coming home late at night. Not far from home, the police stopped him, and forced him into a car and drove him away. We only knew this because there was a video camera that recorded this event. This was near a store where he was abducted. For over 2 years, the Russian law enforcement authorities in Crimea have not investigated this in any way, have not presented any information on whether or not the Russian law enforcement agents are involved in this abduction, why he was abducted, and where he is now. For over a year, me and my lawyer have been trying to get the materials on this case with regard to what the law enforcement have done in Crimea. The courts have not granted our access. I have every reason to believe that my son was abducted as part of a plan by the state bodies of the Russian Federation. My son is part of the Mejlis of the Crimean Tatar people, as well as a member of the World Council of Crimean Tatars, and is the vice chair of that body. On many occasions, he was threatened by the FSB as well as his friends, and he was also followed. And this is something he reported about not long before he was abducted. And a few days before he was abducted, there was another attempt to kidnap him. And in 2014 in Crimea, there was a policy to put pressure and to repress Crimean Tatars. In 2014, at least 16 people, one of whom was a Crimean Tatar, were abducted by the Russian Federation bodies. He's still not to be found. I'm convinced that my son was abducted by the Russian Federation for his activities in supporting the rights of Crimean Tatars. I applied to the Russian Federation to fulfill all their international obligations and to give information about this. I also appeal to all of the other delegations to request to help us to find my son and to find out what happened to him. For 2 years.
Here, I'll move on to the next speaker in the interest of allowing everybody a fair opportunity for their point. Thank you very much. The next speaker at the Bar Moscow Legal Center.
Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. I am a Russian lawyer, and for the last few years I have been working in Crimea, and I deal with defending Crimean Tatars who undoubtedly suffer from the consequences of the Russian occupation of Crimea. We talk today about national minorities, and if we look at the first occupation by Russia of Crimea was in the late 1700s. This led to the genocide and deportation of Crimean Tatars. And then this, of course, happened under the Stalin regime. Unfortunately, for not much time, they were able to live in peace until, once again, Russia, now already in the face of the Kremlin regime, once again is rounding people up from their houses. And with respect to their children, you heard a number of speakers talked about their personal tragic stories related to this Russian occupation. Unfortunately, Russia and Russian authorities are carrying out racial discrimination towards Crimean Tatars. They forbid them from having their own representative bodies. The Mejlis representing Crimean Tatars was recognized as an extremist organization, and the Russian Federation for a year and a half now has been ignoring a UN indication that the Mejlis should be restored. I'd like to draw attention to the fact that Crimean Tatars today and over the past 4.5 years find themselves in an extremely difficult situation. There are dozens of people who are imprisoned on trumped-up charges, criminal charges, and hundreds of people are forbidden from carrying out any social or civil society activity. In this connection, I'd like to make a recommendation, and that is that greater attention be paid to the problems faced by Crimean Tatars and to solving the issues of national minorities. This should be a priority. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and also thank you for including a recommendation. We'd encourage all participants to include recommendations in their contributions, and if possible, you could start with them so that we're clear where it's leading. Okay, thank you, and I pass the floor to the next speaker.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Nora Detweiler, and I'm from the Brussels office of the Baha'i International Community. One of the most important and urgent conversations we have in Europe today is the one about what it means for diverse people to live together. One of the main concerns arising here is how to combat discrimination, racism, xenophobia, and other forms of prejudices. As important as these endeavors to remove barriers that prevent people from pursuing their aspirations and participate in society are, they constitute primarily a starting point for creating an inclusive and diverse societies. However, thought must be invested into creating those conditions which will allow populations to not merely live side by side, but for people of all backgrounds to gain those capacities that allow them to work shoulder to shoulder towards the transformation of their communities. The most effective way of achieving this goal is to invest in educational processes that reinforce the belief of the oneness of humankind and build capacity in people to better contribute to the betterment of society. The knowledge that is generated through such processes can then replace prejudices and give way to collectively working together for achieving the goal of the betterment of society. Youth especially have great potential to acting as protagonists of constructive change, given their heightened energy, their idealism, and their special capacity to mobilize people. Therefore, we would like to encourage member states to ensure a framework for school education that provides for building capacity in youth to jointly transform their communities. Additionally, we encourage civil society to think about how to foster spaces and capacities in wider society, which are targeted towards jointly building unified communities that celebrate diversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I hand the mic to the next speaker, the NGO Russian School of Estonia. The floor is yours.
Здравствуйте.
Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. My organization and I, for many years, have been fighting for education in our native language. There are communities, 60% of which speak Estonian and 30% speak Russian in Estonia. So more than a third of the population historically lives and studies in the Russian language for 300 years, the Russian language. However, there has been increasing nationalization by the Ukrainian authorities of the educational system. It began with higher education, and now it has stretched to Russian schools. There is a developed campaign on, for instance, closing Russian kindergartens. The requirements for teaching in the Estonian language in schools is linked to the fact that Estonian is the national language. Russian is the autochthonous native language of the Russians who have lived there since the 17th century. We would like to note the right recognized to education in one's native language. However, if we look at the preamble to the Constitution, we see that the goal is to protect Estonian language, Estonian culture. The government is thus trying to enforce this policy in all areas, including in education. In keeping with this strange logic, the need is to fight against everything that is not Estonian. This is testified to by the fact that the government does not ensure that everyone who wants to is able to study Estonian. It was only this year that free Estonian language classes began to be offered. Many thousands of people who wanted to participate were unable to do so. We call on Estonia not to ignore its own legislation and to ensure all rights to its national minorities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And now I would like to move to our next speaker, the distinguished delegate from Kazakhstan. The floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, Kazakhstan is a multi-ethnic country. This is why issues of the harmonization of inter-ethnic relations have always been a priority for state policy. The main measure of prevention is the Kazakhstan People's Assembly, which represents all ethnic groups. It includes central government, local, and local associations. The Assembly provides for the representation of ethnic interests at all levels of the country's public life. There's a special law on the People's Assembly, in line with which all decisions of the annual session must be taken up by other state bodies. In 2010, the Assembly elaborated a national doctrine for national unity, which today is the basic principle of our official state policy with regard to ethnic groups. That is one country, one fate, unity and diversity, the development of a national spirit, which is the foundation of all the strategies, concepts, and social development programs that touch upon the inter-ethnic relations in the country. The Assembly fully is in line with the Ljubljana Declaration on the Integration of Diverse Societies. It includes over 1,111 ethnic associations, 29 republic ones, as well as support for cultural methodological centers through 40 houses of friendship. In April 2018, the law on the Assembly of the People of Kazakhstan were amended in order to boost the efficiency of the Assembly's work. The law introduces the ethno-cultural unity as an effective measure of an individual structure of the Assembly with regard to accreditation. For the first time, the law sets down the mechanisms of government support for these types of ethnic associations. We have created all of the conditions necessary to develop the linguistic rights and education on ethnic minority languages. There are schools and clubs where the traditions of the 26 ethnic groups are studied. There are 52 publications in 15 languages, 4 TV programs on using 11 languages. We also are using many different minority languages, including the Uyghur and Korean language, as well as German. The experience of Kazakhstan with regard to such an institution is very unique, and I'm convinced that it will be of much interest to the OSCE countries. The full text of my presentation will be given to the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. And now I'll move to the next speaker on our list. The floor is yours.
Good morning, distinguished participants. I represent the regional Bulgarian National Cultural Autonomy of the Republic of Crimea. And on behalf of my colleagues, I speak as well.
For a moment, please. We have a point of order. And
we have point of order, Mr. Moderator.
Yes, under the rules, I'm giving you the floor just now. Thank you.
Mr. Moderator, the delegation of Ukraine would like to raise a point of order on general conduct of HD. We address it to you as the Italian OSCE chairmanship and ODIHR. The co-OSCE documents establish agreed norms and principles and contain commitments to abide by them. In particular, the Helsinki 1992 document, which has a prominent and direct relevance for the human dimension, reaffirms the validity of the guiding principles and common values of the Helsinki Final Act and the Charter of Paris, defining them as, I quote, collective consciousness of our community, end of quote. It is with these principles and values in mind that we expect the conduct of human dimension events to be in full compliance with the OSCE acquis. However, now we witness an attempt of violation of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine and the repeated provocative attempt to use the IHD for legitimization of illegal occupation of Ukraine's autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol by Russian Federation. The floor was requested by the representative of the entity that was registered by the occupation authorities in Crimea in accordance with the specific law of the Russian Federation, namely the Federal Law on National Cultural Autonomies. Application of the legislation of occupying power in the occupied territory contravenes international humanitarian law. We expect the OSCE ODIHR to continue to be strictly guided by respective OSCE decision that recognizes the legal status of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea as integral part of Ukraine, as reflected in Journal number 3 of the 27th meeting of Committee of Senior Officials in Prague, 1994. Giving the floor to the speaker, Mr. Moderator, would be against the OSCE principles of commitments, the said OSCE consensus decision, as well as provision of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 68-226, territorial integrity of Ukraine. Based on these arguments, we request that this speaker to be removed from the speaker list. I thank you.
Thank you very much. We've taken careful note of that, but we have a second point of order now. So I'll pass the floor to the delegate from the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for giving me the floor. As the point of order, I wanted to make the following statement. Based on the fact that this meeting is not part of meetings where decisions of any territory belonging to any specific state, and the fact is that it is unacceptable to interrupt statements of any speaker with regard to any kind of issue with regard to which areas belong to which states. So we call upon our Ukrainian colleagues not to interrupt our proceedings with unnecessary responses. And we reserve the right that if this type of excessive measure is used again, we will continue to raise points of order. Thank you.
Thank you to both delegations for the points of order. The speakers may take the floor only in the capacity in which they are registered and under the name which they are registered, in this case a civil society organization. I will return the floor to the speaker on the strict condition that this is observed.
Thank you.
Спасибо.
Thank you. Let me say that I represent the interests of national and cultural autonomy of the Republic of Crimea on behalf of Germans, Greeks, Armenians, and other national or minorities who note that all the provisions of the Copenhagen document of the Human Dimension Conference all of these provisions are respected by the Russian Federation in Crimea. We have schools, we have the right to speak in our national or native languages on all platforms. We are able to practice our religions, and we have contact with each other inside the Russian Federation and out with others outside the Russian Federation. We are able to use our native languages. We can access media in our languages, newspapers, magazines, television stations, and so on. With respect to the Bulgarian community, my community, there is no aggressive nationalism or chauvinism against us. Not only have the equalities of all been ensured regardless of their belonging to a minority, There is multiculturalism in Crimea. It has been fully realized. We consider that the negative ideas about Russian Crimea come from a lack of knowledge of the situation. We are convinced that each of you, if you would come and visit us in the Republic of Crimea, we could show you the openness of which we speak. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. I will now pass the floor to our next speaker on the list, which is the delegation of Ukraine.
Thank you. I'm Andriy Yurash, Director of the Department for Religious Affairs and Nationalities. First of all, we would like to express our great appreciation to all introducers for their valuable ideas shared with us. As the country with the essential number of people representing the national minorities, Ukraine objectively doomed for the serious covering a question of protecting these groups. Now, when Ukraine celebrates 100 years of restoring its statehood, would be appropriate to remind that from its first steps on the way of building a modern state, among 16 ministries founded in 1918, 3 of them had been directly involved in solving minorities' problematics. That are the ministries for Polish affairs, for Jewish affairs, and for the Russian affairs. 3 mentioned minorities had been the most numerous and influential at that time. Surely, in 100 years after the described situation, now we have different picture in the corresponding area, but its importance is an undisputable thing. Ukraine keeps unique system of institution on the regional level in areas of compact accommodation of minorities designed to ensure a preservation the basic elements of identity of minority groups. This system was established and shaped immediately after the Second World War, when in frame of the Ukrainian Republic, relatively numerous communities of Poles, Romanians, Hungarians, Moldavians, Bulgarians continued their presence. This system includes hundreds of preschools, secondary schools, special chairs in the universities dedicated to study of languages and cultural heritage of minority groups, also libraries, places for performing the national arts. Unfortunately, any neighboring country which has numerous Ukrainian minorities on their territory cannot demonstrate the same or even a relatively close level of fulfilling of needs of the local Ukrainians. For example, Russian Federation, having on its territory several millions of Ukrainians, is unable to found at least one Ukrainian school. At the same time, Ukraine support and completely finance 471 Russian schools, 71 Hungarian, 70 Romanian, 5 Moldavian, 5 Polish, and so on. Also, there are around 600 schools with educational process in 2 and more languages. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. Now I'd move to the next speaker on our list. The Gasprinsky Institute for Geostrategy. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Nariman Ostayev. I am Director General of Gasprinsky Institute for Geostrategy, based in Kyiv, Ukraine. Crimean Tatar people historically were formed in Crimea as an indigenous people of the Crimean Peninsula. And I believe that it is not wise to act against indigenous people. Today, I want to speak for the Crimean Tatar people seeking justice, equality, democracy, independence, and political participation. Changing world has brought Crimean Tatar new challenges, the main one of which is annexation of Crimea by Russian Federation. Russian authorities persecute Crimean Tatars literally every single day. And these illegal Russian activities, such as arrests, destruction of our cultural heritage, mainly the destruction of the Han Palace in Bakhchisarai, the only architecture heritage since Khanate times, take out our attention and resources away which could be directed on preserving our national heritage as well as comprehensive development. Russia skillfully uses the fact that many problems related to the protection of the political, economic, and cultural right of the Crimean Tatar people for more than 2 decades had not been duly resolved by the local official Crimean authorities before 2014. I want to use my voice to declare that a safe future of the Crimean Tatar people is now the best way to stability and security in the Black Sea region, to revitalize world political agenda. And now we have strong support from Ukrainian authorities. The President of Ukraine gave an instruction to prepare the draft amendments to Section 10 of the Constitution of Ukraine, Autonomous Republic of Crimea, where the interests of the Crimean Tatar people should be taken into account, and the rights and duties of the representative authorities of the Crimean Tatar people are specified. I remain fundamentally optimistic about Crimean Tatar people's future. And my confidence is rooted in studying the ups and downs of my people's history. Our nation is still unified by various aspects. Islam is our religion given by God. Our young generation knows mother language history well, and our values of freedom, equality, and opportunity still draw people from everywhere to our shores.
Thank you.
Actually, you can find. May I?
If you could wrap up, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And actually, you always can find Crimean Tatars on the front lines of democracy. We forward our energy and intellectual resources for fighting for our values and democratic future.
Okay,
we just need to sharpen our tools and use them on the best way. Thank you.
Thank you. The next speaker on my list is the delegation of the Russian Federation. The floor is yours.
Distinguished Chairman, distinguished colleagues, ensuring the rights of national minorities is inextricably linked with states' policy on preventing aggressive nationalism, racism, chauvinism, and xenophobia. However, an analysis of events in the OSCE area shows continued worsening of the situation. According to official statistics from the UK Ministry of the Interior, published on 17 October 2017, in 2016 and 2017, the number of hate crimes increased by 29%. The situation of the Russian-speaking population in the Baltic countries is worsening. I refer not only to the shameful phenomenon of mass statelessness in Latvia and in Estonia, due to which national minorities suffered discrimination, specifically economically and on the labor market. In these two countries, as well as in Lithuania and Ukraine, there is an aggressive assault on Russian language education. Obviously, the result is not an equalization of the graduates' opportunities on the labor market. Rather, it is attempts at forcible assimilation and open discrimination against the Russian language population in these countries. What is more, the Estonian parliament is now examining a draft law providing a tenfold increase in fines applied to legal persons if their employees have a weak command of the Estonian language. In the past, the fine was 600 euros, and now it is 6,400 euros. We are also deeply concerned by the situation in Ukraine, where with support from the Ukrainian government, radicals from right sector, Trizuba in the name of Stepan Bandera, Ultra Orange, and other groups openly call on the internet for the mass murder of so-called undesirable citizens, including Russian speakers. They also publish lists of potential victims with their personal data. In May of 2018, members of the nationalistic party Right Sector, through its own so-called court, if it can be called that, pronounced the death penalty against 52 officials of the Russian Federation for their official activities. These were deputies and persons working in law enforcement. The death penalty is to be carried out at the first opportunity by any of the members of this criminal nationalistic group. And here is a copy of it. You can see that my boss is, in fact, listed here. Judging from information in the press, Ukrainian right radical groups Thank you very much. In this connection, we'd like to call upon Canada to stop supporting nationalists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your contribution. We will move on to the next speaker on the list. The floor is yours, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Mr. Ababakadze. I'm the chair of the International Organization of Meshinsky Turks, Vatan Yolda. Our people have been deported on 3 different occasions. The Meskhetian Turks live in many different countries of the world, almost 500,000 people. You know that our people has suffered from many different tragic events and our fates. The deportation from Georgia in 1944, where over 10,000 people perished, including old people, women, and children. In the pogroms in Uzbekistan in 1989, where many thousands of people had to flee, leaving everything behind. In 1994, there was a pogrom against Turks in Krasnodarsk. 17,000 people had to flee and to immigrate to the United States, having left all of their property behind in Russia. Thanks to the Council of Europe and the OSCE, in the year 2000, in July, the government of Georgia passed a law on the repatriation of the Meskhetian Turks, where it became possible for our people to return back to their homes. However, the law is not being enacted or is being enacted not in full. This is why our people do not have the right to come back home. Today, about 40,000 over the past decade were able to return only. Distinguished participants of the OSCE, I appeal to you as the most authoritative body in Europe on the rights of minorities. Your words of appeal towards Georgia could move them from this stalemate. We would like you to request that the government of Georgia should ensure the application of its law in full. Resolving this issue will help us to move from the stalemate and return hope to tens of thousands of people. We hope that your humanism, your well-being, and your goodwill will play its role. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. The next speaker on the list is Political Movement, Group 24.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Nuruddin Rizoi from Tajikistan, representing Political Movement, Group 24. According to today's topic, ethnic Tajiks make up over 80% of the population. As part of the government's nation-building process, it has emphasized the importance of an ethnic Tajik nation in culture at the exclusion of minorities. Uzbeks make up 30% of the population. There are smaller minorities of Pamiris, Kyrgyz, Arabs, and Turkmen, as well as a largely urban-based Russian minority. The government continues to limit the access to education in minority languages. Uzbek representatives who criticize the government policies towards ethnic minorities have been targeted. For example, activist Salim Shamsuddinov disappeared in 2013 after he appealed to the Uzbek minority to support an opposition candidate in the presidential election. Shamsuddinov had criticized the government's policies towards minorities in media interviews. Officials have prevented members of minority religious groups, also including Jehovah's Witnesses, from registering their organizations. Pamiris, who practice Ismailism, continue to face discrimination. Christian groups have also been targeted by the government. In July 2017, a court sentenced Bahram Kholmatov, a pastor from South Korean church Sonmin Sonbogin, to 3 years imprisonment on charges of extremism. In conclusion, I can say that Rahmanov and his regime not acknowledged national minorities and religious minorities entirely in Tajikistan, and he will be the cause of conflict and separation in our country. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, sir, for your contribution. The next speaker on the list is Independent Human Rights Protectors.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Hussein Ashuruf, Independent Human Rights Protector. According to today's topic, I can say all people are born equal in right and dignity, regardless of race, nationality, religion, political views. Unfortunately, intolerance and discrimination in Tajikistan are part of the internal policy of the current dictatorial regime of Imam Ali Rahmanov. The persecution of people of other political views, opposition and dissent is a vivid example of the intolerance of the existing regime. Also, the right of believers are systematically violated by law enforcement agencies, from wearing women's clothes and men's beard to choosing the name for the newborn is strictly controlled by the state. There is intolerance and hostility at the level of the first person to the believers. Recently, dictator Rahmanov himself, in his speech, accused the opposition of commitment to the Shiism, one of the branches of Islam. It was like Shiism is a crime. He forgot probably that in Badakhshan, autonomous regime live many adherents of Shiism. This is a vivid example of intolerance of the first person of the state to the adherent of a certain religious trait. In addition, the people of Badakhshan were attacked by the regime's army in 2012. Since then, the regime has been killing, kidnapping, and commanding the unwanted authorities of this region. Their civil rights and the right of self-determination are systematically violated. It should be noted that in today's Tajikistan, the social status of people is determined by geographical origin of citizen, from admission to university and employment. Advance depend on the geographical origin and loyalty to the regime. If a certain citizen was born in the same region as Rahmanov, he has a high chance of becoming successful. This is also a part of Rahmanov's policy.
Thank you. May I ask you to
Therefore,
wrap up
I
your
call the
contribution?
international community to investigate at the international level the crime committed by Rahmanov's regime and to call upon the regime to respect its international obligation and to abide by international law. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. May I remind all participants please to stick within the time which has been allocated. In the interests of fairness, we have 50 speakers on the list, and we must be equally fair to number 50. Okay, the next speaker on my list is the delegation of the United States of America. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The OSCE region continues to witness serious contraventions of OSCE commitments regarding the rights of persons belonging to national minorities. In Bosnia and Herzegovina, not all individuals enjoy equal political rights due to pervasive ethnic discrimination. Within the Bosnian entity of Republika Srpska, official policies and rhetoric have sanctioned discrimination against non-Serb returnees. The Republika Srpska's government plan to adopt Serbia's curriculum fails to consider the needs and sensitivities of non-Serb students and appears designed to encourage ethnic Serbs to associate themselves more with Serbia than with Bosnia and Herzegovina. Within the Federation, the, quote, two schools under one roof, end quote, policy institutionalizes the separation of the Bosniak and Croat communities, and in our view is the wrong way to heal the divides caused by war. Serbs in Croatia continue to face intimidation and historic revisionism, which some officials fail to sufficiently condemn and correct. Minority communities in Kosovo face discrimination in employment, access to legal and social services, and restrictions on the freedom of movement. Conflict survivors are traumatized by denials of past wrongs, such as the July 1995 Srebrenica genocide, or when high-level officials express support for those convicted of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide in Serbia and Croatia. Mr. Moderator, the Russian Federation's occupation of parts of Ukraine and Georgia is an egregious example of aggression and nationalism. In Russia-occupied Crimea, authorities have banned most Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar language media, replacing the content with Russian programming. Russian occupation authorities commit gross and widespread harassment of organizations representing minority communities. Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars can no longer gather to celebrate their national holidays.
School instruction in their languages has decreased dramatically, and their leaders have been subjected to arbitrary arrest, interrogation, politically motivated persecution, and imprisonment. The United States fully supports Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. We do not, nor will we ever, recognize Russia's purported annexation of Crimea. In Russia-controlled territory in eastern Ukraine, civilians considered to have pro-Ukrainian sympathies have been imprisoned, tortured, and subjected to extrajudicial killings. In Russia-occupied regions of Georgia, ethnic Georgians and others face restrictions on their fundamental freedoms, including freedom of movement. Kyrgyzstan imposes overly broad restrictions on the ethnic Uzbek population as part of a wider policy of discrimination that hinders ethnic Uzbeks access to education
Thank you, sir. May I ask you to wrap
and
up
to
your
media in their
contribution?
native tongue. Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We'll submit the full length of our statement.
Thank you, and sorry I didn't know you were going to wrap up in 2 seconds. Okay, the next speaker on my list is the Association of Central Asian Migrants.
Thank you very much, distinguished chairman, ladies and gentlemen. I am from Tajikistan. In this report, I would like to express my deep respect to you and tell you about a tragedy that is taking place now with one of the ethnic groups in Tajikistan. 20 years after the official coming into being of my country, there continues to be constant pressure by government circles of Tajikistan on national minorities. There has been active participation in armed conflict leading to a civil war. The situation is worsening from year to year. Currently, there are 6,000 to 7,000 people forced to live outside of their native areas, and many people have been forced to migrate. In the entire post-Soviet period, we have been able to break this down into a number of steps. First, there was the Civil War, in which there was an unsuccessful attempt to take over this national minority and take control of them. But this was unsuccessful. Hundreds of residents of the valley that was attacked found themselves punished, and there was the former Minister of Defense of the country who was also related to this activity. What is more, similar pressure continues to be exerted, including on the children of these migrants. Recently, in one school, there were activities that clearly discriminated against these children. There have been trumped-up cases against the residents of this valley. Clearly, the international community, the OSCE, the United Nations, and other human rights defenders need to pay more attention to these gross violations. We need your help. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And moving on to the next speaker, the Western Thrace Minority University Graduates Association. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The Turkish minority in Western Thrace gained its status in 1923 with the Peace Treaty of Lausanne. Today, members of the Turkish minority are facing serious problems regarding enjoying their rights, which emanate from and guaranteed by bilateral and international conventions and agreements. First of all, we would like to highlight once more that the ethnic identity of the Turkish minority is still denied by the Greek authorities. Also, no steps have been taken to compensate the loss of almost 60,000 minority individuals affected by the application of Article 19 of the Greek Citizenship Code, which can be considered as an example of racism or ethnic cleansing. In accordance with the international and bilateral conventions, The Turkish minority has the right to establish, manage and control its own educational establishments. Also, the Hague recommendations and the Ljubljana guidelines underline the importance of educational rights of the minorities. However, these rights have been constantly violated by the Greek state. The Greek authorities still turn deaf ears to minority kindergartens. The application of Culture and Education Foundation of Western Thrace minority for opening a private kindergarten remains unanswered since 2011. Therefore, Mr. Moderator, we would like to repeat once more that the Turkish minority would be honored if a fact-finding mission of the OSCE, Office of the OSCE High Commissioner for National Minorities pay a visit to Western Thrace to see one of the least developed regions of the EU. We would like to recommend Greece to recognize the ethnic Turkish identity in Western Thrace, take all necessary steps to redress grievances of the victims of Article 19 without any delay, take into consideration its international obligations and respect to the Turkish minority's right to education, to allow the Turkish minority to establish bilingual nursery schools, to have a sincere and concrete cooperation with the Turkish minority representatives during the legislation processes. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on the list is Think Out.
Thank you very much, moderator. I am Abdil Kara speaking on behalf of Think Out. In general, in OSCE region and in particular in Europe, the Muslim community are often treated as members of a religious minority group. There is often blind eyes to discrimination of this minority group. I can give a lot of examples of discrimination in education, rental market and job market in Europe. This is a direct result of the right-wing rhetoric and discourse of politicians, mostly supported by media who are looking for sensational and uplifting news. We must realize that this clearly discriminates Muslim minority groups in different areas and make them victims of violence. To give only a few examples, within the right-wing populist AfD party in Germany, we heard dangerous voices. Previously, the AfD politician Markus Frommeier reacted, "If the state does not protect citizens, the people will take matters into their own hands." On the other side in France, Laurent Wauquiez, who is on the agenda with anti-Islamic and anti-immigrant rhetoric throughout the election campaign, believes that a thorough policy on these issues should be pursued. The new leader often voices Islam's threat to the identity of France, thinks that street prayers and fundamentalist Muslims are a threat to secularism. Wauquiez, who frequently emphasizes French identity, is following an attitude towards social conservatism in his political discourses. He points out that multiculturalism is a danger and that French and Christian values should be praised. We have to ask the question, which values are some European representatives in member countries representing? And we can make this list longer and longer. We have to take action. As OSCE, this challenge has to be one of OSCE's main objectives. We have to be aware that the seeds of hatred and probably violence appear through the statements and rhetoric of all politicians. Our recommendation is therefore that hate crimes against minorities must be prosecuted very strictly and effectively, and the focus in politics should be more on preventive actions instead of remedial actions. Thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much for your contribution. May I take this opportunity to remind delegations that we maintain a sign-up sheet for the right to reply. Okay, the next speaker on the list is the Movement for the Renaissance of Northern Epirus. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Honorable representatives, since the communist regime, the Albanian government has recognized as Greek national minority with the corresponding rights only 99 villages in the municipalities of Dropolis and Finiki. However, they do not fully respect them even there. Areas with the indigenous Greek population such as Himara, Arta of Avlona, Mursi, and many Greek villages in Koritsa and Premeti continue to be deprived of any right they should have as part of the Greek national minority. In October 2017, a so-called law on minorities was adopted, which in terms of its practical application depends on the goodwill of the Albanian government. Although this law provides free national self-determination, if someone who is not registered as Greek in the registry office wants to change that in his official record and declare his Greek nationality, the office says it's not authorized to make the change. In the urban centers of northern Epirus, such as Argyrogastro and Agis Saranda, the population has been completely altered, which is also taking place in Himara. A typical example of this in the village Politsani of the Pogoni area, where a family of Muslims was officially registered in the registry office in violation of Article 16 of the Council of Europe Framework Convention on National Minorities. Various tricks, such as fake documents, they steal the properties of the Greeks in northern Epirus, as is the case with the villages of the Finiki region, whose residents are desperately trying to save their homes through the Albanian courts with squatters who appear as descendants of Aegis. Under the pretext of tourism development, a population replacement is being underway in the municipality of Himara. In Himara, the demolition of 19 buildings belonging to the Greeks has been launched under the pretext of creating a tourist park. The demolitions were postponed by a decision of the Court of Avlona, but this is only a temporary decision and the Greek properties are not permanently secured. An extensive looting of land belonging to Greece is in progress on the coastal front of Yali, Drimades, Draleos, Palasa, where already large tourist complexes of Albanian interest are being built. In the spring of 2016, in the village of Drimades, the Albanian government also removed land ownership titles for 123 native families to make it easier for Albanian settlers to move in the village.
May I ask you to wrap up your contribution?
At the expense of supposedly protecting Greek minority. Thank you very much.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And now we'll move to the next speaker on the list, which is the delegation of Tajikistan. Sir, the floor is yours.
Mr. Moderator, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, today I'd like to share with you the situation regarding tolerance and the inadmissibility of discrimination in Tajikistan. Despite unfounded criticism, it should be emphasized that the Republic of Tajikistan observes all of its commitments in the area of ensuring rights and freedoms of all of its citizens, regardless of their nationality, ethnic group, religion, cultural, or other beliefs. Let me especially point out that the tolerance of Tajiks for centuries is demonstrated by the fact that they lived and worked side by side with other nationalities and followers of other religions and beliefs. A clear example of the tolerance of the government and people of Tajikistan is the efforts made by the country's leaders to return to civilian life those individuals who've taken part in radical or extremist groups. For citizens of Tajikistan in this category, all conditions are created for their rehabilitation and integration into society. One example of this are the former members of radical and extremist groups who have, in fact, been able to return to civilian life. I myself am one of the former leaders and founders of the Party of Islamic Renaissance from the 1980s. And with me here in the room is another former leader and founder of the party, Rahim Karimov. And I broke away from this organization because I recognized my own errors and I understood the horrible nature of these activities. And I was affected by the speech given in 2017 in Warsaw by Mr. Kabiri with respect to the fact that the party wishes to return to Tajikistan in the elections of 2020. Now I am a teacher in the Islamic Institute of Tajikistan. I believe that I have now been able to return to live peacefully and in calm, working for the good of all peoples, and I call upon others in my situation to do the same thing. The full text of my speech is available within the Secretariat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And the next speaker on the list is the Latvian Human Rights Committee.
Thank you. The most urgent issue from those relating to national minorities in Latvia now is education. In March of this year, the Parliament of Latvia has adopted amendments to the education law, which abolish education in minority languages in high school, grades 10 to 12, which was already limited in public schools, but now it's being abolished both in public and private schools, except the mother tongue itself. It's also being restricted in primary school. According to the new edition of the law, from grade 1, at least half of the lessons will have to be in Latvian, both in public and private schools. Starting from grade 7, at least 80% of lessons must be in Latvian. Besides, in June this year, the Parliament has also amended the law on tertiary education institutions. In this case, the public universities have long been forced to use either Latvian language or, in some cases, EU languages, official languages. Now, the same regulation will be applied also to private universities and colleges. This is deprivation of choice in case of schools for approximately 57,000 of pupils, and in case of tertiary education for approximately a third of private university and college students. This is a concern which was met with deep concern from very international institutions. It was criticized by the Committee on Elimination on Racial Discrimination, and besides this discrimination and minority treaties, it's also against the Convention on the Rights of the Child, because it is against the best interests of the children, as defined by Hague recommendations. So our recommendations for Latvia now are first to withdraw the amendments to the education law and law on the tertiary education institutions, to invite relevant UN special procedures, both on minorities and on education, for a country visit. Latvia has long issued a standing invitation, but it doesn't work very well in practice. And to make Hague recommendations the basis of its policy in education. For OSCE, we invite to use the existing mechanisms to promote Hague recommendations in Latvia and to conduct a country visit from OSCE institutions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the next speaker on the list is the delegation of Azerbaijan. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. One of the most important features of the nationality policy of Azerbaijan is that Azerbaijan protects minority languages and provides education in languages of national minorities living in Azerbaijan. In accordance with the Constitution and the law on education, the Azerbaijani government has created for minorities appropriate and adequate opportunities to learn their mother tongue, to get education in their native languages. Here are some statistics related to schools in languages of national minorities. There are above 350 comprehensive Russian schools with above 90,000 pupils. There are schools in Georgian, in Hebrew, in Lezgin, in Talish, in Avar, in Sahur, in Udi, Kurdish, and Khanalik languages. The government cares also to provide schools with teaching materials in languages of national minorities. Textbooks on Lezgin, Talish, Kurdish, Tat, Avar, Sahur, and other languages are provided. New texts on Avar language, Lezgi, Sahur, Khanalik, Talish will be published next year. As we see, Azerbaijan government creates necessary opportunities for national minorities to get education in their native languages, which is in its turn leads to their further integration into the society and their active participation in public life. The measures of the Azerbaijani government are done in compliance with the Article 4, Paragraph 3 and 4 of the Declaration on the Rights of Persons belonging to national or ethnic, religious and linguistic minorities, which says that states should take appropriate measures so that wherever possible, persons belonging to minorities may have adequate opportunities to learn their mother tongue or to have instruction in their mother tongue. Also, it is being done in compliance with the Article 14 of the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, which says the parties undertake to recognize that every person belonging to a national minority has the right to learn his or her minority language in areas inhabited by persons belonging to national minorities traditionally or in substantial numbers. If there is sufficient demand, the parties shall endeavor to ensure, as far as possible and within the framework of their educational system, that persons belonging to those minorities have adequate opportunities for being taught in minority language or for receiving instruction in this language. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. And now we would pass the floor to Stichting Civitas Christiana.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The Civitas Christiana Foundation, as being part of the associations in defense of tradition, family, and property, would like to contribute to this debate, first by denouncing and second by recommending. There is a movement composed of several associations throughout the world who uses tolerance and diversity as their motto, but who are the same ones that are spreading intolerance and discrimination, namely the LGBT movement and its gender ideology. In Germany, several parents were already put in jail when their children refused to attend to so-called sexual and gender education. In the US, United States, schools are being imposed transgender bathrooms. In several countries, the gender ideology is being taught for 6-year-old students without the knowledge of their parents, while the teaching of Christian principles is often forbidden. The LGBT lobby has also infiltrated the church and spread within its bosom a fierce persecution against the resisting faithful.
Thank you. If I could just make a statement at this point, I would like to remind all participants to adhere to the provisions of the Code of Conduct, including respect for the principle of non-discrimination. Thank you, and I hand the floor back to you, sir.
Thank you. And this is it's exactly my point, saying that in several countries, for instance, the Netherlands, Argentina, Brazil, US, Switzerland, we have documented several cases of hate crimes committed against peaceful protesters in the name of the above-mentioned tolerance. All those who rise up against such imposition, especially in the name of God's law and natural law, are facing lawsuits, media uproar, and even career interference. Such widespread persecution was already denounced by Plínio Correia de Oliveira, who foresaw such new secular inquisition back in 1985. So in concrete terms, we would like to respectfully ask OSCE to withdraw from its publications that are seen in the corridors the terminology imposed by the LGBT movement, such as this, gender equality. Otherwise, it will be, with or without knowing, contributing to this subtle but real imposition of a noisy minority over a silent majority. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and we'll move to the next speaker on the list, the Charitable, Cultural and Education Fund Loose. The floor is yours.
Distinguished colleagues, let me start by the most important idea I wanted to get across to Europe and the world, and that is the fact that the Crimeans in 2014, in a free referendum, decided to join with Russia. This is a very important thing in principle. We were very much citizens of Ukraine until the government was usurped in that country after what happened in Maidan in Kiev. But there's an anti-Maidan that the Crimeans were for, and their lives were threatened, and they were even killed because of that stance. And this resulted in the Crimeans holding a referendum and to en masse vote to join with Russia. We were citizens who followed the law up until a point where the government of Kiev stopped being legitimate for Crimeans. Secondly, I wanted to state that the rights of all ethnic minorities, which is an important tenet for the EU and for Europe, are respected in Crimea with regard to national minorities, and my colleague from the Bulgarian community stated this already. Here I represent the Armenian community in Crimea, and I wanted to say, all you have to do is come to visit Crimea, and you will see for yourselves that since that time, as when Crimea joined with Russia. There is a small town near Simferopol where many Armenians live. And over this period of time, this community has flourished. There are roads being built there. We have a gas pipeline. The electricity supply is being improved. Water supply has once again been reestablished to this village. This village where Armenians used to be deported to. But I'm talking about more than Armenians. I heard many new points of view here and very unjust statements with regard to Crimean Tatars. If you come and visit us, you will see that there are mosques being built. It's beautiful. It's enormous. There is a Crimean Tatar holiday now, which has become a holiday for all Crimeans. And the last point is that everyone views life from their own viewpoint. I have two vice chairs from Crimean Tatar community.
Thank you. We have to keep moving on. Thank you. May I also request people not to film? We have noticed some people filming, and we would appreciate if everybody could stick to the rules. Okay, we're moving on. The Federation of Western Thrace Turks in Europe. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The importance of the participations of persons belonging to national minorities in associations is specifically stressed in the Decision 6 of the Helsinki document of 1992 of the OSCE. Associations funded by the members of the Turkish community in Western Thrace, Greece, whose names include the word Turkish, are not currently allowed to operate legally. The associations such as Kısanti Turkish Union, Komatini Turkish Youth Union, and Western Thrace Turkish Teachers Union were dissolved in 1986 by local courts, although they were legally registered and operated since their establishments in 1920s and 30s. The Supreme Court ruled that the dissolution of these associations was justified. Following to the final judgment of Supreme Court, 3 associations, including Kısanti Turkish Union, applied to the European Court of Human Rights in 2005 for the revocation of the Supreme Court's decision. The ECHR ruled unanimously that Greece breached the Article 11 regarding the freedom of association of the European Convention on Human Rights. A law proposal brought to the Greek Parliament in September 2017, which would make Greek domestic courts implement judgments of ECHR on the associations belonging to national minorities living in Greece. Pursuant to the reactions by the junior coalition partner of the government, the initial legislation was modified and new conditions were added to the final text adopted in October 2017, such as the association should not threaten the national security. After the adoption of the above-mentioned law by the Greek Parliament, Kısanti Turkish Union has started a legal process for the return of its official legal entity. Thrace Court of Appeal rejected Kısanti Turkish Union's application for the reopening of the domestic proceedings. Therefore, the case was rejected on procedural grounds. As it's noted by ODIHR in the Guidelines on Freedom of Associations, minorities should be able to join associations and establish their own association without discrimination. We urge Greece to act on the principles in the guidelines, recognize the important role of these associations, and treat all of its citizens without discrimination. We call upon Greece to take, without any further delay, all necessary measures so that all applicants benefit from proceedings in compliance with the ECHR judgments. Thank you.
Thank you, and a reminder that we are almost on time, but we will have to continue to be strict so that everybody on the list has the opportunity to speak. Okay, the next speaker on the list, please. Wiener Akademikerbund. Apologies for my pronunciation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I'm Henrik Clausen of Wiener Akademikerbund. I would like to address the question asked about preventing aggressive nationalism. Aggressive nationalism is a dangerous situation where the rule of law is challenged and constitutes a threat to democracy itself. This also has scary historical connotations. Fortunately, the best solution is simple: more democracy. And we are noticing positive developments, in particular east of Vienna. Aggressive nationalism appears precisely when the government and the established elite disregard the concerns of the citizens, thus violating the principles of democracy. Democracy means rule by the people and implicitly for the people. Concerns of the citizens are simple. They are about rising crime rates, our cars and schools being burned down, about rape rates doubling or tripling, about the financial burdens of immigration, about the nuts and bolts of daily life. Aggressive nationalism has appeal only when our representatives ignore such simple, reasonable concerns or even try to silence them, as we have seen in some cases. Such neglect damages the confidence in our democratic institutions and must be avoided. Problems related to immigration exist to various degrees in all countries west of Vienna. We have thousands of ghetto areas, in French, zones urbaines sensibles, where our secular laws cannot be effectively upheld and where parallel societies outside our secular law are developing. This is bad. To prevent extreme nationalism, we need to take care of our nations, integrate the immigrants into our society, uphold our laws, and avoid granting special rights to any groups. One law for all is a principle that we cannot compromise upon. Thus, we recommend that OSCE participating states take concerns of the citizens seriously, even if roughly worded. That OSCE participating state governments focus on protecting the interests of their own citizens, and that governments ensure the effective upholding of national laws. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and well timed. Okay, next on the speakers list we have the International Platform, Global Rights of Peaceful People. Do we have
Distinguished moderator, distinguished colleagues, I would like to talk about violations of the rights of national minorities in Ukraine. Often we see a situation in which right radical elements, including the police, do not let people participate in conferences or meetings to talk about issues that are of concern to them. And our international platform, the Global Rights of Peaceful People, in August held a forum on the violation of the rights of national minorities. This was held in Budapest. Hungarians, Poles, and others came to the event, but there were no Russians. Why not? Well, because if the Hungarians have a president and a parliament that fights for their rights, unfortunately, since Russia is considered a state aggressor, no one is protecting the rights of Russians. Now, the conference took a number of resolutions, adopted resolutions, and I have copies of them here if you would like to see them. Let me come to recommendations. The recommendations from this forum, which was, again, an international platform, are the following. First of all, we recommend that ODIHR create a commission or something along those lines in order to solve issues following the deconstitutionalization of Ukrainian policy on linguistic education. This is what's of most concern to us. Then there is the issue of Podcarpathians in Ukraine, in the United States, and in Canada, and in most countries of the European Union. Their rights are recognized. So we would like to see a special group created in order to deal with the recognition of this group of Podcarpathians. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker on the list, Human Rights Vision Foundation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, dear ladies and gentlemen. Last year, we touched upon the issue of discrimination in Tajikistan and cited specific examples of discrimination on racial, national, gender, and other grounds of intolerance in Tajikistan. Unfortunately, the survey shows over the past year, the situation with human rights in general and in particular has deteriorated significantly. The largest ethnic minority in Tajikistan is the Uzbeks. There are not many opportunities for the Uzbeks to fully participate in the social and political life of the country. The Uzbeks are practically not allowed to be elected as candidates for elected bodies. It's not easy for them to become deputies, mayors, even in the territory where they constitute the majority. In the highest mountainous region of Murgab, where Kyrgyz predominantly live, there is a very difficult social situation. The Kyrgyz population is subjected to extreme discrimination in the world of work. Representatives of this nationality reported that they are not recruited, including in places where construction and mining are going on. The quality in general schools with the Kyrgyz language leaves much to be desired. The acute shortage of educational materials in the Kyrgyz language and teachers remain urgent problems of the Kyrgyz society in Tajikistan. Last year, we also reported on the discrimination of the center towards another ethnic minority, Pamiri. The main problems that we touched on last year remain relevant to this day. The mass killings committed in 2012 and 2014 remain unsolved. In addition, discrimination continues toward this population during employment and especially in law enforcement agencies, including in the territory of the Badakhshan autonomy itself. The Human Rights Vision Foundation recommends Tajik authorities to establish cooperation with Kyrgyzstan to improve the conditions of for obtaining secondary education in schools in Tajikistan with the Kyrgyz language, to provide schools with educational materials in the Kyrgyz language and develop a plan to attract teachers. It's urgent to ensure the possibility of the Murgab population and all Badakhshan legal employment in the construction sector and mining. Turning to international institutions and Western countries while establishing and maintaining relations with the government of Tajikistan, we call for a more rigid link between providing grants and other assistance with respect for human rights. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Moving on to the European Centre for Democracy Development.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I will speak in Russian. Во-первых, хотел сказать.
Firstly, let me say that the Khanat Palace in Crimea has not been destroyed. That is untrue. My family was there this summer. It is a beautiful palace, and we enjoyed seeing it. Now, going back to the topic, traditional issues such as anti-Semitism, anti-Roma precedent, as well as others that grow in intensity over the years. We've seen over the years that we have new issues coming up. Russophobia. There's nothing new here because the group that is considered to be non-loyal talked about this when Mr. Vernes spoke. In the 60s, the government said that the Jews were responsible for what Israel was doing. This led to a spike of anti-Semitism in the USSR. Now, today, people are trying to say that European Jews are responsible for what Israel is doing, which has led to a spike in anti-Semitism in the EU. The Russian-speaking minority living abroad are now made to be responsible for the policy of Russia. This is a provocation against Russians. The laws that glorify the Nazi Bandera in Ukraine has limited the rights of Russian speakers to have education in their own languages, as in Ukraine and Latvia. And it is difficult for Russians to live there because they are sometimes suspected of being traitors anytime that Russia says something they don't like. The authorities are making an enormous mistake in this, not only because democracy means accepting many different points of view and different values and cultures, but also because it really provokes radicalization. what we're doing leads to the creation of a Russian threat, a Russian fifth column in our countries. This is typical of all countries in the West. In Europe today, we see new challenges that we are going to have to grapple with for many years to come. Just like today, we're trying to deal with the rise of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. This glaring Russophobia is also seen amongst OSCE participating states. Does your organization only deal with trying to reinvent the wheel, or are we going to deal with something more serious? We need to make sure that we deal with the Russian-speaking populations and not to provoke hatred against them. I appeal to the human rights institutions to try to take under control the rise of Russophobia in Europe. Thank you.
Okay, well, we've heard what you've said and taken note. Thank you. And we would move on to the delegation of the Netherlands on behalf of the European Union.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union. The following countries align themselves with this statement: the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia, Montenegro, Serbia, Albania, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, Georgia, Andorra, and Moldova. Mr. Moderator, the European Union strongly believes that protection of human rights, including the rights of persons belonging to national minorities, is crucial for maintaining regional peace and stability. The rights of persons belonging to national minorities are an important aspect of our cooperation with all our partner countries, including our closest neighbours, and are consistently raised in our political and human rights dialogues. Within the EU, Article 21 of the Charter of Fundamental Rights prohibits discrimination on any ground, including membership of a minority group. This protection is bolstered by EU directives tackling discrimination. We reiterate the importance of an effective implementation of legislation on the protection of persons belonging to national minorities and their non-discriminatory treatment throughout the territory of participating states. We consider the office and the mandate of the High Commissioner on National Minorities to be of the utmost importance for the OSCE concept of comprehensive security. This autonomous institution is and should remain a core conflict prevention instrument for the whole OSCE area. 25 years after its foundation, the institution of the HCNM is as relevant as ever. The European Union supports the HCNM's active engagement throughout the OSCE region, aimed at providing early warning and early action in order to prevent tensions involving national minority issues from turning into conflict. We commend the HCNM for providing a neutral platform for dialogue in order to find a way out of the deadlock. In addition, we welcome the HCNM's continued engagement with regard to language and education issues, as well as efforts to improve sustainable integration of diverse and multi-ethnic societies, while at the same time preserving the respective ethnic identity of the communities concerned. Our recommendations and questions will be included in our statement that will be submitted to the Documentation Center. Mr. Moderator, we reiterate our strong condemnation of the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol to the Russian Federation, and we will not recognize it. We therefore regret that the attempts...
I may ask, I know you represent a lot of countries, but I must be strict with all the speakers.
Yeah, excuse me. I'll just finish my sentence, please. We therefore regret that the attempts by some participants of this meeting to use a legitimate opportunity for discussion and dialogue to make points relating to a situation that is in contradiction with Helsinki principles. The full statement and the final list of aligning states will be submitted to the Documentation Center. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I do apologize for the interruption. The next speaker on my list is the delegation of Hungary.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We align with the EU statement, however, let me make some remarks in our national capacity. Hungary considers the office and the mandate of the High Commissioner on National Minorities to be of the utmost importance for the whole concept of comprehensive security of the OSCE, providing early warning and seeking early action with regard to tensions involving national minorities. This year, we had the opportunity to meet with the High Commissioner and engage in constructive dialogue where we expressed our concerns regarding the situation of Hungarian minor communities living in the neighboring countries, especially Ukraine, where an education reform restricting the rights of mother tongue education for national minorities is underway. States tend to address the issue of national minorities exclusively from security perspective, relegating other important aspects, for example, preservation of identity and cultural diversity, to the background. Specific national minority rights, such as mother tongue education, use of minority language, adequate representation in public, economic, and social sphere, are indispensable for avoiding their assimilation. We deem important for participating states and for international community to realize that national minorities are not only the sum of a number of individuals, but represent also a system of relations among them. Bearing in mind the aforementioned, our recommendations are: first, Ukraine fully implements the recommendation on the education law of the Council of Europe, Europe's Venice Commission, including regarding the transition period and finding a balanced approach to guaranteeing the right to mother tongue education for national minorities. Participating states adopt, in close cooperation with national minorities, a structured approach in implementation of commitments and obligations undertaken at international level concerning the rights of national minorities, with a view to ensure the peaceful cohabitation among communities and to prevent further assimilation of national minorities. And finally, participating states adopt a coherent and consolidated legal framework related to minority rights protection, fully respecting the acquired rights of national minorities. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next on my list, I have the Center of Political Analysis and Forecasting, Crimea.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Good morning. I said yesterday about the station with freedoms that has developed in the Crimea now, but this is not a one-time incident. This is the process that have developed over the past 200 or 300 years. Now the Crimean Tatars, Kremlin, the indigenous people of the Crimean constitute a national minority in the Crimea. These people with a million population, a rich history, the experience of national statehood, is on the verge of extinction, deprived of fundamental freedoms. The Russian Empire and the USSR destroyed my people systematically. In the period of the formation of Ukraine, in the post-Soviet period, it was an unsystematic process, and therefore we were able to revive culture, education, recreate resources for existence and renewal. Unfortunately, signs of systemic nature have appeared in recent years. Previous speaker presented much evidence to this. How it's possible? Why did all the participant countries allow this in the 21st century on the territory of their responsibility? It should not be. I ask all countries that are not indifferent to the fate of the people fighting for survival to help us. Recommended for all countries: firstly, pay attention and help Ukraine to ensure not only the Crimean Tatars living in the controlled territory, but also to restore the work of national institutes, cultural institutes, national and religion education. Second, together with delegations of Russia, to work to prevent discrimination of the Crimean Tatars in the Crimea, to restore the work of national institutes, the theater, print media, real national television, to ensure the mandatory study of the Crimean Tatar language in the Crimea. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on the list, Public Union Labris.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I am presenting this statement to address multiple forms of intolerance, discrimination, and violence against lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans people that persevere in Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, perpetrated by various state or non-state actors. Police officers regularly torture, persecute, and extort LGBT people, while there are no protection mechanisms in place. Bias-motivated acts of violence are not being investigated. Equal access to justice system does not apply to LGBT people. As a civil society, we have documented cases of corrective rape, of lesbian and bisexual women, and family violence, none of which is addressed by their governments. In Tajikistan, the Ministry of Internal Affairs started creating a list of LGBT people in 2016, by which it allows police officers to track and hunt down LGBT people, arbitrarily arresting them, torturing and extorting them. In Uzbekistan, where same-sex conduct is still criminalized, police officers have been reported to kill trans women and gay men. While a gay man was being attacked and murdered by a crowd in public, the police stood by without taking any action. In Kyrgyzstan, police officers have raided trans women's apartment after the Minister of Internal Affairs had made a statement about cleaning the city from sex workers. They were detained and exposed in humiliation and mockery. Police officers invited journalists to film them. Research from Kazakhstan shows that half of the Kazakh LGBT community has experienced violence or hate crimes because of their sexual orientation and gender identity. It's clear that existing legislation and policies in these countries do not protect LGBT people from violence and discrimination, while incitement to violence and discrimination against LGBT people are on the rise, and the influence of negative publication in the media and ongoing impunity of attackers. More and more LGBT people from the region are forced to flee and seek refuge in the third countries. In spite of the many acts of intolerance, discrimination, and violence, the government in Tajikistan has forced organizations providing assistance and services to LGBT people and sex workers to close. They are forcing to go underground and are not allowed to receive funding, while they are essential in promoting tolerance and discrimination of LGBT people. In Kazakhstan, LGBT organizations are officially allowed to register, but they are not allowed to go for rent an office under their organization names or to open the bank account and apply for institutional donors. In Uzbekistan, association is clearly out of the questions. Moderator, with the following recommendation, we call Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan to withdraw all discriminatory legislations and policies and introduce anti-discrimination legislation that's effective policies promote tolerance and non-discrimination, develop and implement a system of awareness raising. Yeah, thank you.
You may also circulate your recommendations via the documents distribution system. Okay, next on my list, Unis dans la diversité linguistique.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator, for giving me the floor. Distinguished representatives, my name is Emmanuel Lemerlus. I represent the NGO United in Linguistic Diversity, which sets out to promote the Breton language, which is spoken in France, in Brittany. This is the last Celtic language spoken on the European continent. At the beginning of the 20th century, over 1 million people spoke this language. As today, the majority of these people are in their 70s. Unless France's attitude changes with regard to the Breton, only some dozen thousand speakers will remain. UNESCO classified the Breton language as being a language which is seriously endangered. In 2017, French justice system refused that a French couple should name their son Franche, claiming that this Breton name contains an N letter with a tilde, which is not part of the French language. In July of 2018, the Minister of Justice confirmed this refusal by opposing the modification of a circular with regard to using diacritic signs with regard to names on the civil status documents. 29th of March, the National Assembly voted a proposed law with regard to regulating private schools. This law will make it more difficult to open new schools using the Breton language in the Divan network. Last June, the school district of Rennes gave instructions for that high school diploma math exams written in Breton language should not be graded. It is only geography and history written in Breton is allowed, while high school students in the Basque countries do have broader rights. Their tests in history, geography, and math can be provided in regional languages. Last June, the school inspector of the Loire-Atlantique region refused to open a French-Breton bilingual class in the city of Chateaubriand, while all of the conditions were in place to open the school. This refusal is infringing the law on the renewal of schools and the 12 April 2017 circular on regional languages. And finally, France is not a signatory to the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities. This statement will be available through the document distribution system. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. The next speaker on my list, Salut.
En France,
In France, in March of 2018, a former president of the Republic, 3 former prime ministers, and 300 personalities in all published a manifesto called The Call of the 300 after the hate crimes perpetrated against the Jews by Muslims, asking, and I quote, that the Quran verses calling for the murder and the punishment of Jews, Christians, and other non-believers should be rendered obsolete by the theologian authorities of Islam. But from the next day, numerous Muslim personalities in France once again denounced an unfair and outrageous trial, trying to justify the violence of the Quran by the violence that supposedly is in the scriptures. The Call of the 300 condemns ethnic cleansing that recently compelled 10% of the Jews in France, that is something like 50,000 people in the Paris region, to flee their homes. But it doesn't mention the fact that numerous French citizens who are not Jews also had to flee their homes due to the incivilities taught by the book that means that all Muslims, and I quote, "Between us and you, it is enmity and hate forever, up until you will believe in Allah only." This is Quran 60.4. This is how, and there is a spread of areas of lawlessness where the police no longer dares to set foot. While we see the number of Polish or Hungarian immigrants coming to France, the threat of terrorist attacks will not go up. Why? That's because there's an alliance between Christians and Jews and the people of Israel, bringing all of humanity as brothers. And so this is why this good news has become an enemy of humanity and God. We would like to ask ODIHR to support this approach of the Call of the 300 and to help Muslims to put in place this religious revolution which has been called for by General al-Sisi of Egypt.
Thank you, and I would now pass the floor to the delegation from Serbia.
Thank you. The Republic of Serbia is deeply committed to protecting and continuously improving the rights of national minorities. The Republic of Serbia fulfills the obligations in the field of human and minority rights that arise from the ratified international and regional agreements and accept the findings of the bodies responsible for monitoring the implementation of these agreements as a basis for undertaking further measures and activities. This is evidenced by the determination of the Republic of Serbia to prepare a special action plan for the realization of the rights of national minorities adopted by the government of the Republic of Serbia in 2016. The preparation of this important strategic document was made in cooperation with representatives of national councils of national minorities and civil society organizations. The objective of the government of the Republic of Serbia during the preparation of the action plan was to establish concrete measures and activities as well as funding funding that will ensure the full implementation of the applicable laws and thus the promotion of rights of persons belonging to national minorities. In order to achieve full inclusiveness of national minorities in the process of monitoring and full cooperation of the work of the state bodies, monitoring of the implementation of action plan has been entrusted to the Council of National Minorities, the working body of the government comprised of line ministers, component state bodies, and presidents of all national councils of national minorities, and headed by the Prime Minister. The fact that the Prime Minister is presiding over this body shows the readiness of our state to lead the dialogue on the minority policy at the highest level. The action plan consists of 11 chapters that cover areas in which national minorities exercise their right, and these are personal status, position, prohibition of discrimination, culture and media, freedom of religion, use of language and scripts, education, democratic participation, appropriate representation of persons belonging to national minorities in the public sector and public enterprises, National Council of National Minorities, economic status of persons belonging to national communities, international cooperation. The full statement will be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you also for a contribution which is exactly on point of today's discussion. Next on my speakers list, we have the Constantinopolitan Society.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Penelope Fouyaxi. I was born in Istanbul, and I'm here as a member of the governing board of the Constantinopolitan Society, which is a non-governmental, non-profit organization established in 1928 in Greece by forcibly expatriated members of the Greek minority of Istanbul. We thank preciously the OC and the Italian chairmanship for the opportunity to address our concerns about the actual implementation of human dimension commitments and identify further action which may be taken by Turkey as participating state regarding human rights of the Greek minority in this country. The Turkish government continues to impose significant restrictions and serious limitations on human rights, such as psychological oppression, thereby threatening the survival and the future of the Greek minority, the remaining Greek minority in Turkey. These policies have led to the dramatic decline of the Greek population of Turkey from over than 100,000 people in early 50s before the pogrom of September 1955 and the expatriation of Greeks from Istanbul in 1964. Nowadays, we have less than 1,500. The property rights of the Greek minority foundations continue to be violated, specifically have suffered from massive confiscations of their properties. Over a period of 5 years, the foundations remain unable to hold elections to renew the membership of their governing boards because the Turkish authorities, despite promises to do so, have still not promulgated new regulations to replace those repealed in 2013. This de facto abolition on conducting of elections in all non-Muslim foundations by the General Directorate of Foundations openly breaches the Article 40 from the Treaty of Lausanne. Just one sentence, if it's possible. Thank you. Signed from Turkey and Greece in July 24, recognizing the Muslims minority of Western Thrace and the Greek Orthodox minority of Istanbul. The full text of our statement, as also some recommendations, are posted on the Human Dimension Implementation Meeting official website. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Next on the list is the Human Rights Platform. The floor is yours.
Good afternoon. The Human Rights Platform is Spishnavarta from Ukraine. We call upon the OSCE to support our demands to ban in Ukraine the activities of armed formations in right parties and organizations which espouse the ideology of aggressive nationalism. 28%, and I refer here to organizations such as Azov, Svoboda, Bratstvo, Right Sector, and others. They carry out anti-Semitic and chauvinistic slogans in the past 4 years, these far-right radical nationalists have become the useful tools of the authorities to scare the population and to eliminate dissenters and unwanted people and organizations. They attack journalists, block and set fire to the offices of opposition media, and they attack and use scare tactics towards veterans attempting to protect Second World War monuments. They also undermine peaceful assembly on the part of opposition political parties, and they have attacked representatives of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. More information is provided in the materials that we provide to the conference. The far-right groups are openly carrying out activities involving the law enforcement authorities. The group C14 has been financed by the Ministry of Youth for a project on political education, and its leader, Yevgeny Karas, has also been elected to a council in the National Anti-Corruption Office. Let me recall that from 20th to 21st April, there was a pogrom of the Roma and Sinti camp at Lisai Gore, and in the beginning, the authorities recognized that so-called activists from C14 had carried out an event in this location. The fact is that these things have taken place in other areas as well. The Ukrainian authorities are legitimizing the aggression of C14. We draw attention to the site Mirotvorets, where so-called collaborationists are listed. This is taking place in Ukraine. After the revolution of 2014 in Ukraine, there has been no democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. Next on the list, we have CIS, Europe Monitoring Organization.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My name is Alexei Semenov. I'm a political scientist, and I would like to pay attention to the fact that the discrimination against the Russian-speaking minority continues in Latvia. As you already know, restrictions on the education in minority language were introduced in this country. School education in the native languages of traditional and ethnic linguistic minorities is one of the most important values of the European Union. The Russian-speaking community of Latvia is one of such minorities of the EU, not worse than the others, and its rights should be respected by the Latvian authorities. Russians are the largest national minority in Latvia, accounting for about 25% of the population. The Council of Europe's Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, ratified by Latvia in 2005, specifically stipulates that in regions traditionally populated by representatives of national minorities in significant numbers, the authorities are obliged to make every effort to provide the representatives with, as far as possible, the appropriate opportunities to receive education in their native language. As we clearly see, Latvia violates its obligations to protect the rights of national minorities and develop regional languages and minority languages on its territory. Besides, the authorities of Latvia do not make efforts to the solution of a problem of the so-called non-citizens. This year, the bill on automatic assignment of Latvian citizenship to newborn children of non-citizens was completely rejected. For comparison, in neighboring Estonia, where the problem of non-citizens also exists, in 2016 amendments were introduced into national legislation, according to which the children of non-citizens will automatically receive the citizenship of the country from the moment of birth. The majority of non-citizens are former citizens of the USSR, mostly representatives of national minorities who were deprived of the right to citizenship after the collapse of the USSR. The number of non-citizens is about 12% of the population of Latvia. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Okay, next on my list we have Bewegung gleicher Möglichkeiten für alle.
Уважаемые дамы и господа,
Ladies and gentlemen, I just wanted to briefly to come back to yesterday's topic. It's important for everyone to realize that our founders are Adam and Eve, which means that we are all brothers and sisters. Let us not judge religion by what certain religious leaders do from certain religions. If we want to wish the best for anyone, we need to wish the best for everyone. If we wish that we should have nuclear bombs go off, we need to make sure that we don't wish that on others. If we are talking about wishing millions of immigrants on one country, it means that we're going to suffer from that ourselves. We need to monitor the trials going on in Russia, trials against terrorists who include migrants from Central Asian countries. In Russia, based on different sources, there are 5 up to 7 million migrants from Central Asian countries who are being used in cases against terrorism. In other words, they are not active terrorists, but they are used in these trials, and no one knows why. Well, the values, artificial or real values that exist in different countries with regard to the LGBT movement. Well, I am against for registering such NGOs in Central Asian countries because they are counter to our traditional values. A recommendation to Uzbekistan to create a state commission on the rehabilitation of the victims of political repressions. That must be done. Secondly, to assess what Mr. Islam Karimov has said and to stop perpetuating his name, the name of a bandit. This is how the president of Uzbekistan, Mirziyoyev, said yesterday about the team of the president. This is an official reference to Radio Freedom. This is what he exactly said. To have a meeting with NGO representatives in Europe and in France during the President Mirziyev's visit to France, that's going to be quite soon. And I request for my own rehabilitation for Uzbekistan without any conditions should rehabilitate my name. Since I have not committed any crimes, I did not trade on my conscience. Please rehabilitate me. We will see what happens next year. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on my list, we have the delegation of Belarus. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Less than a year ago, on the 30th of November of 2017, the government of Belarus presented its periodic report to the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination at the United Nations in Geneva. The report has a comprehensive reflection of our national laws and the law enactment practice in this area. At the high expert level, there was a discussion on issues that are regulated by the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in all its forms. Today, the relevancy of this convention is growing. Constant attention and the unflagging work nationally and internationally is required to eradicate racial discrimination, as well as a way of preventing new xenophobia, which has been fueled by the mass movement of peoples in recent times. Belarus, in these times of concern of political changes, has been able to avoid all forms of conflicts. We have created good conditions in order to ensure the rights of citizens with regard to their beliefs and the work of national religious organizations and other associations. The law on national minorities in Belarus guarantees to citizens who are part of the minorities equal political, economic, and social rights and freedoms in line with our national laws, including the right to use their mother tongue and to choose which language they would like to use to communicate, as well as their right to education in various languages. We have a multi-ethnic, a multi-confessional society, which is based on our traditions and our history. When we talk about history, I would like to stress that the peoples who live in Belarus during the Second World War directly faced the issues of genocide and racial supremacy. 1/3 of our population disappeared during those years. This is why today Belarus actively endorses and supports anything that will put an end to these actions. We are a co-author of a UN resolution combating Nazism, neo-fascism, and any practice that escalates the modern forms of xenophobia and racism, discrimination, and intolerance. We call upon OSCE participating states to undertake all efforts to ensure that the memory of the past should be a good foundation for more active efforts to combat discrimination, nationalism, racism, and anti-Semitism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. We have already 14 rights of reply registered, so I can inform delegations that there will be 1 minute each, strictly, for the right to reply. If you want to register and you haven't done so yet, please do so now. I have 7 remaining speakers on the list. I would kindly ask you to keep it to 2 minutes if possible. We will allow you up to 2.5, but if you can keep it to 2 minutes, we would appreciate it. Thank you. The next speaker on the list, Tajik Democratic Freethinkers.
Thank you, moderator. I am from the Forum of Tajik Democratic Free Thinkers, and I'd like to refer to discrimination against people in Tajikistan that has been referred to by others here. Let me begin with the recommendations to the Tajik government: create conditions for the media to broadcast and be written in the languages of those in the autonomous region, and to curtail the practices that are repressive practices against our people. The head of the Tajik delegation has suggested that people return to their country. I would like that he have his family return from Austria. They are, of course, involved in these protections of the International Protection Against Racism, and Ibdelim Karim and his family are under international protection in Germany, and they're asking us to recognize that everything is fine in our homeland. I will provide the full text of my statement to the Secretariat. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Next on my list, we have the delegation of Romania. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We fully align with the EU statement, and I would also like to make a few remarks in my national capacity. My name is Ana Maria Angelescu, and I represent the Ministry of National Education of Romania. I'd like today to briefly present the main aspects of the human rights education for persons belonging to national minorities in my country. Romanian Ministry of National Education is constantly working on ensuring quality education while promoting the democratic citizenship and the respect of fundamental values. Romanian national legislation ensures the rights to education for national minorities from preschool to higher education and throughout all the counties of the country. According to the Romanian legislation and in accordance with the national minorities' decisions, pupils belonging to national minorities may study all disciplines in their mother tongue, except for the Romanian language and literature. If they are enrolled within educational units where Romanian or other minority language is the medium of instruction, they may study the following disciplines in the mother tongue: the language and literature, the history and traditions of the respective minority, and musical education. The two types of education for persons belonging to national minorities have been organized as follows: teaching in the mother tongue for persons belonging to Hungarian, German, Ukrainian, Romani, Slovak, Serbian, Czech, Croat, Italian, and Turkish national minorities, and teaching the mother tongue within educational units where the medium of instruction is Romanian or other minority language for pupils belonging to Armenian, Bulgarian, Greek, Italian, Polish, Romani, Russian, Czech, Croat, German, Hungarian, Serbian, Slovak, Turkish, Ukrainian national minorities. New curriculum was developed for primary and secondary education, including for education in the language of the minorities. Moreover, the Ministry of National Education took measures to improve the quality of teaching the Romanian language in national minority schools. These include the development of a special curricula, which was elaborated specifically for this type of education, and more recently, the provision for qualified teachers in primary schools. We are currently working on publishing textbooks according to the approved curricula, including for the schools providing education in mother tongue. As a general indicator of our commitment to ensuring the teaching of cultural diversity in all our educational systems, the recent curricular reform included a series of measures regarding the expansion of intercultural education. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. Next on my list, the delegation of Armenia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. My delegation would like to refer to 3 issues under the discussion of this session. First, we agree that Bolzano-Bozen recommendations are a useful framework for addressing rights of national minorities under certain circumstances. At the same time, we would like to stress that Bolzano recommendations should not be considered as exhaustive or main framework to this end. In our view, not in all situations, strictly etatic and interstate framework could be beneficial for national minorities. We believe that first and foremost, we need to empower national minority by providing more ownership and capacity to address individual and collective rights of its members, rather than transform it into an object of interstate relations. Second, political participation is certainly one of the efficient tools of increasing ownership and capacities of national minorities. The recent legislative changes in Armenia provided more sustainable framework for national minorities to be a part of national decision-making. As a result, 4 assigned seats have been allocated to 4 major national minorities of Armenia, such as Yazidis, Russians, Assyrians, and Kurds in the parliament. The National Assembly has already adopted motions put forward by these MPs. Third, in our view, aggressive nationalism should be tackled in more systematic manner and in larger context of protecting human rights and fundamental freedoms. Aggressive nationalism and promotion of hatred have been a comfort zone for the governments who violate human rights of their own people on a daily basis, depriving them of rights to vote and form the government, to receive and impart information, to realize right to peaceful assembly and association, and so forth. In our view, the link between poor human rights record and aggressive nationalism should be thoroughly studied. In this regard, we would like to make one recommendation. We recommend the ODIHR to initiate study which would effectively correlate the human rights indicators, particularly freedom indexes, with the finding of Council of Europe country reports. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on my list, Jenna Kost.
Thank you. National minority councils were introduced in the legal system of the Republic of Serbia as a model of exercising cultural autonomy of national minorities. However, in many important ways, national minority councils have failed to fulfill this initial role. Rather, they have promoted the self-isolation of minority communities and hinder interaction between minority communities and the broader Serbian society. From early on, neither the role nor function of national minority councils were clearly defined. This resulted in 2 main problems. First, national minority councils became highly politicized. They have been misused both by majority and minority political parties. Secondly, national minority councils repeatedly overstepped their public powers beyond the 4 areas prescribed by the law and continue to monopolize overall minority policy, including the allocation of public financial resources. Legislative changes made in June 2018 regulated the most acute problems and led to a harmonized legal framework pertaining to national minorities. However, these changes failed to tackle the fundamental challenge of national minority councils, which is that in their present role they contribute to the creation of parallel societies and thus the segregation of minorities. Therefore, a broad public debate should be initiated by the Serbian government. This debate should include civil society and examine alternative models for cultural autonomy of minorities in Serbia as the general approach taken by the state to minority issues. Furthermore, the role and public powers of national minority councils should be reconsidered and made to serve the best interests of both minority communities and society as a whole. We must apply inter- and cross-cultural approaches when developing and implementing minority policies. Finally, although the political nature of national minority councils may not be fully prevented, the over-politicization of these bodies must be held in check and eventually eradicated, with the overstepping of public powers strongly sanctioned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, the Association Center of Protection and Researches.
Distinguished organizers and participants of the meeting, in Central and Eastern Europe, a law was taken on the rights of national minorities, but currently the situation of the rights of these people remains of concern. In Lithuania, the number of schools with Russian language in the 28 years of independence has dwindled catastrophically to only 32. The reason for this decrease is multifaceted. Part of this is a lack of reform of the educational system, as well as demographic factors and migration processes. One of the most important factors is Russophobia, which is spread by the media, and a negative image in society that is created of the Russian-speaking population. This is especially of concern given the attempts to limit the use of native Russian by the legislative authorities of the country. There is a plan so that by 2023 there will be a certain percentage, that is 60%, in the state language, and only 40% of education will be provided in native languages. Problems arise also with Russian television and newspapers in the country. There are accusations of a lack of loyalty to Lithuania on the part of those broadcasting in Russian. There are pretexts also that the channels that are broadcasting in Russian are not providing reliable information. There's also problems related to the retaining of monuments from the Second World War, and relating to the consecration of the remains of soldiers who fought in that war. This conflict is arising as well. Thank you very much. The full text will be given to the Secretariat.
Thank you, and apologies for the interruption. Okay, next on the list, OSCE Parliamentary Assembly.
Distinguished participants, it is an honor for me to speak to you as chairperson of the Third Commission for Peace in the OSCE. My full text will be provided to you, which will allow me to focus on the recommendations of the Parliamentary Assembly. Now, during the various annual sessions, the Parliamentary Assembly of the OSCE had major statements that are related to combating racism, intolerance, and xenophobia. I'm especially thinking about resolution passed in Tbilisi in 2016 called a call for action of the OSCE in the face of violence and discrimination. It contains several very strong recommendations, including the one to strengthen the police capacity and other specialists of law enforcement, and issues of security to combat discrimination, and also to step up relations with vulnerable communities and to focus on inclusive and diverse labor forces, for example, by strengthening the current efforts made by the point of contact for the Roma people and with regard to strategic efforts by the police. Another recommendation, it was an outcome of an OSCE conference called Making Progress with Regard to Tolerance and Non-Discrimination by Establishing Coalitions and Cooperation, which was held in 2015. Also, there is a recommendation to enhance essentially the means by which the Ministry of Equality, Education and Culture, as well as other competent bodies, to prevent and to counter prejudice and discrimination in the public and private sectors, including in schools. Our last Parliamentary Assembly, which was held in Berlin, also contains some very robust recommendations. Mr. Moderator, allow me, by way of conclusion, to share with you a text by Bertolt Brecht, which was written in German. When they arrested communists, I wasn't worried. I wasn't a communist. When they arrested the Jews, I was not worried. I was not Jewish. When they arrested Catholics, I was not worried because I was not Catholic. When they knocked at my door, there was no one left to worry for me. No one was left. Thank you for your patience and for your attention.
Thank you. We have one remaining speaker on the list, the regular list, Eastern Human Rights Group.
Good afternoon, distinguished participants. I'm Pavel Lysansky of Ukraine. I carry out human rights defense activities in Donetsk and Lugansk and in the areas that are occupied by the Russian Federation. In the Donbass, there are more than 110 different nationalities, but today, in the occupied territories occupied by the Russian Federation, there is illegality and violation of human rights. In these areas that are under the control of illegal armed formation supported by the Russian Federation, there is slavery, exploitation of people who find themselves in this situation in which they have no defense or protection of their rights. These illegal armed formations are repressing people, including national minorities. They're thrown into prison, and this based on legislation that is very similar to that of the Russian Federation. These citizens who find themselves imprisoned in the occupied territories in Donetsk and Lugansk have no opportunity, the authorities have no opportunity to protect the rights of these individuals. And these violations of human rights by armed formations supported by the Russian Federation mean that there have been some liberation that has taken place since 2014. I would like to call on the OSCE international community to pay attention to violations of human rights and rights of national minorities in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, and to ensure that the Russian Federation withdraw these armed formations that are limiting and violating the rights of national minorities living in these areas. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll now move to the right of reply, which is exercised by delegations only. The right of reply will be in the following order: Romania, Tajikistan, Georgia, Albania, Germany, France, Bulgaria, Greece, United States of America, Ukraine, Russian Federation, Austria on behalf of the EU, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, United Kingdom, Uzbekistan, and Serbia. As you can see, we have 18 on the list. There will be exactly 1 minute for each delegation. First on the list, Romania. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Romania exercises the right of reply with regards to the intervention of the NGO Miklo Imre. As a general remark, I point out that its allegations are simply not true, and we strongly reject them. Now, I would like to briefly underline 5 aspects. 1. Regarding the use of minority languages in the local public administration, Romania has a comprehensive legal framework. The law on public administration contains a number of important provisions meant to ensure the exercise of the right of the use of one's mother tongue. I mention only that in the territorial units where citizens belonging to national minority represent at least 20% of the total population, the authorities ensure the use of their mother tongue. 2. As of the right to express in the mother tongue before the courts of law, persons belonging to national minority in Romania do enjoy fully this right. Upon request, the court has to ensure the exercise of this right. Also, upon request, the court has to ensure free of charge the use of an interpreter or an authorized translator. 3. Regarding funding, I won't expand on data, but only underline that through the Department of Interethnic Relations, the Romanian state financially supports non-governmental organizations. I will conclude. As regards the constitutional control exercised by a constitutional court is legally guaranteed for the indicated entities, and by no means can one say that it's being exercised on ethnic grounds. The international reports are available on websites, and the full version of our intervention will be distributed in writing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Everybody must stick to the time, otherwise we will have to end. Okay, the next on the list, Tajikistan.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We have heard from representatives from the Group of 24 and the Islam Renaissance parties, which are not really NGOs, and they are banned in my country. This party, 24, and the Renaissance of Islam NGOs are terrorist extremist organizations, according to my country. Their statements can be described as slander, lies, and insinuations. These statements were targeted to really mislead the participants here. In order to give any serious grounds to their statements, they were referring to problems with regard to Ismailites and Shiites in Yazgulamts, as well as other national minorities, Tajikistan, that they completely made up, which categorically does not reflect the real situation with regard to ISIL. Tajikistan works actively with OSCE on minorities and the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination of the UN, whose reports show the real situation of Tajikistan in these spheres. Thank you.
Thank you. And if I may say that the interpretation will end at 1:15, whether we're here or not. Okay, Georgia's next on the list. Thank you.
Thank you, dear moderator. I would like to exercise the right of reply with regard of public organization Meskhetian Turks. Georgia has already accomplished all commitment undertaken upon its accession to the Council of Europe to facilitate the process of repatriation. In their recent information note classified on 16 June, the co-reporters of Monitoring Committee of the COE Parliamentary Assembly have positively assessed the steps undertaken by the Georgian authorities regarding the repatriation of FDPs, including an elaboration of legal framework and the comprehensive repatriation strategy. They consider the obligation largely honored by the Georgian authorities within their competence. Moreover, the reporters note that the obstacles facing the applicants are outside of what can be reasonably considered to be responsibility of the Georgian authorities. The most recent information note that Georgia has made considerable and consistent progress in
Thank you. If you could wrap up, please.
In honoring the accession commitment and membership obligation, and has done so in excellent cooperation with the COE. The whole text will be distributed to the distribution center. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Republic of Albania.
Thank you, Chair. We consider the Greek minority not only a genuine bridge for our long-standing friendship with Greece, but also a precious asset of our country's fundamentals and values. The Albanian government is committed to respect the rights of the Greek minority in Albania with all relevant international standards. A law on minorities is in power since last October. This law was drafted in full collaboration with the Office of High Commissioner on National Minorities of the OSCE, the Council of Europe, and representatives of the minorities in Albania. Comments made earlier here on this topic not only used irredentist toponymy, but are dangerously misleading. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on the list, Germany.
Thank you very much. We would like to thank the civil society, represented by Think Out, for mentioning a citation of a conservative politician by the AfD party who threatened to called on people to take the law in their own hands. On this context, I would like to reassure you that in Germany, the law remains in the hand of democratic institutions and an independent judiciary. The rule of law includes the state's responsibility to protect the rights of all citizens and all inhabitants. Germany has learned two important lessons in her history. First, there can be no tolerance for street justice, for hate speech, discrimination, or undermining the rule of law. Second important lesson, a democratic state has much to gain by listening and interacting with civilized civil society to complete judicial action by preventive action. But at the same time, when there is voices by destructive civil society, which we have also learned, that call for discrimination like LGBT people, we will not listen to such kind of advice from civil society, but to constructive voices like we heard from Think Out. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Next on the list, France.
Merci. Thank you, moderator. 2 points in response to various interventions. First of all, France adopted in March its third national plan to fight against racism and anti-Semitism for 2018 to 2020. Our goal is to bring together all ministries, and we implement this with determination. In France, we work to ensure that any act of intolerance, whether anti-Semitic, anti-Rome, anti-Islamic, or other, be pursued by all legal means. France believes that cultures and languages such as Breton contribute to the cultural diversity of France and are an important element of our cultural heritage that we transmit through teaching of and in regional languages. We are part of the European Convention on the Protection of National Minorities, and given our constitutional provisions, we provide for the practice by all persons belonging or not belonging to minorities to exercise their rights without suffering discrimination. Thank you.
Next on the list, Bulgaria.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to exercise my right of reply in connection to some remarks that touch upon the situation of the persons belonging to the Bulgarian national minority in Ukraine, including in Crimea. First of all, I would like to reiterate that Bulgaria condemns the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol to the Russian Federation and will not recognize it. Second, I believe it is not only natural that my country has an interest in the protection of rights of persons belonging to the Bulgarian national minority in Ukraine and in preservation of their cultural identity. It is our understanding that the Bulgarian national minority serve as a bridge between Bulgaria and Ukraine, with due respect for the principles of territorial integrity, sovereignty, and good neighborly relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now we have Greece.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. In reply to two NGO statements, I would like to recall that the Muslim minority in Thrace consists of three distinct groups whose members are of Turkish, Pomak, and Roma origin, having the Muslim faith as their common denominator. The principle of individual self-identification is fully respected. What is not acceptable, in accordance with all relevant international standards, is to subsume Pomak and Roma persons under a Turkish identity which is not their own. On freedom of association, the law allows for the reopening of relevant judicial procedures following a European Court judgment. Relevant cases under the new legislation have not yet been brought before the Supreme Court. There is a thriving civil society in Thrace, and dozens of associations have been registered by the courts in the last 10 years. Finally, on education, in Thrace there are more than 120 minority primary schools, 2 minority high schools, in respect of which special measures have been designed and put in place by the Ministry of Education in cooperation with other entities. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you very much. Next, we have the United States of America.
I seriously doubt that most people in this room or around the world will be fooled by attempts to portray Russia-occupied Crimea as some sort of paradise for minority communities. Nor will visits to the Russia-occupied Crimea change the facts on the ground. As we've heard directly from members of the Crimean Tatar community here, Russia continues to brutally suppress dissent in Crimea, jail dozens of Crimean Tatars on baseless pretexts, and terrorize the Tatar community with violent raids. Approximately 24 extrajudicial killings and enforced disappearances from 2014 to 15 remain unsolved. The United States is strongly committed to enforcing federal hate crime statutes, which allow for the prosecution of certain crimes committed on the basis of, among other things, religion and sexual orientation or gender identity. Over the past 10 years, we have charged more than 200 defendants with hate crimes. The United States strongly condemns violence on any of these bases.
Thank you. And next on the list is Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. The delegation of Ukraine regrets that legitimate point of order on the conduct of 2018 Human Dimension Implementation meeting based on the OEC principles and commitments and existing OEC consensus decision was declined by moderator and not addressed by the OEC chairmanship and ODIHR here. Ukraine took due note of that and reserves the right for further actions in line with the OEC principles and rules of procedure. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Next on the list, we have the Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. With regard to the statements by the United States, I would like, and the EU, would like, and also the last statement by the colleague from Bulgaria with regard to the situation in Crimea, I would like to recall, distinguished colleagues, that the current status of that peninsula was determined as the outcome of a national referendum in 2014, the result of which made Crimea part of the Russian Federation. Secondly, in line with the statement that these delegations, these countries, do not recognize the current political realities, my colleague on the first day of our meetings talked about the non-recognition of those who do not recognize political realities. Our position remains the same and unchanged, and it will remain thus forever. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next on the list, Austria on behalf of the EU.
Thank you. I pass the floor to the representative of the European Union.
Thank you. Our position on the illegal annexation by the Russian Federation of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and city of Sevastopol is very well known. We do not recognize it. On gender equality, EU is committed to it, and it's part of our OEC commitments. Therefore, we support and welcome the work done by ODIHR on the matter, and we encourage you to continue. And last point, we reaffirm our commitment to combating all forms of discrimination, including on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity.
Thank you. Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. I would like to reply to the remarks of the Russian Federation and one of the representatives of civil society. As regards education of national minorities in Lithuania, I would like to highlight two concrete facts. First, during the last 15 years, the number of students in the Russian-speaking schools decreased by 65%, and in the Lithuanian-speaking schools by 38%, while the number of Lithuanian and Russian schools decreased exactly at the same scope by 50%, and this still holds. Secondly, in order to ensure preferential treatment of the education in national minority language, Following the OSCE recommendations, Lithuania allocates 20% more funding for the national minority schools compared to the Lithuanian language schools. I would like to believe that the Russian Federation would be willing to ensure similar standards for the education of its own national minorities back at home. Thank you, Mr. Moderator.
Thank you. Pass the floor to Estonia.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. This is my answer to the Russian School of Estonia and the delegation of Russian Federation. Now, to start with, it's time to get some numbers right. The first, total number of Russian-speaking population in Estonia accounts for 25% of the total, and the second, it is politically manipulative to use the term massive statelessness in our context, as the number of persons with undetermined citizenship comprises only 6% of the population. Mr. Moderator, Estonia is one of the few countries where one can receive education in Russian language at all levels, from primary school to university, and the language of instruction is regulated only at the level of the upper secondary education, which is non-compulsory in Estonia. And Estonian authorities continue to invest considerable attention and resources to enhance the quality of the Estonian language education in Russian schools. Now, to conclude, allow me to quote the OSCE High Commissioner on National Minorities, who recently visited Estonia and gave the following positive assessment to our educational system. I quote, "I took the note of the significant progress made in the integration of the Estonian society during the last 2 decades, especially among the younger generation. Positive results have been achieved, particularly in the field of education, where the knowledge of the state language among national minorities has been improved while preserving of minority identities." Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Latvia.
Dear Moderator, in reply to Russian delegation and a few civil society representatives, I have following remarks and corrections. Non-citizens are in no way stateless in the meaning of the 1954 Convention on Status of Stateless Persons. The number of non-citizens has dropped by more than 500,000 persons compared to the 1995 when the naturalization process began. Approximately 7% of Russian ethnicity residents of Latvia are non-citizens. 99.9% of children born in Latvia in 2017 were registered as citizens of Latvia. The proposed educational reforms, they are to all general education, not only to the, or explicitly to the minority establishments. So the Latvia meets all the international obligations and will continue to guarantee the support for prevention and cultural identity of minorities according to the Framework Convention for Protection of National Minorities. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I pass the floor to the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. Moderator. We exercise our right of reply in relation to the statement by the Russian Federation on UK hate crime data. The increase in the 2016 to 2017 from the previous year is thought to reflect both a rise in incidents alongside improved identification of hate crime by the police, willingness of victims to come forward, and an overall improvement in how police now record crime. We await new hate crime statistics which will be released in October. The UK reaffirms our unequivocal condemnation of all hate crimes and our determination to tackle all bias-motivated crimes. We welcome the fact that Russia has started to provide data to ODIHR, and we encourage them and all states to take advantage of the expertise within ODIHR to improve identification and recording of hate crimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next, Uzbekistan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to use the right to reply with respect to the statement by representatives of civil society. Statements were made allegedly said by the president of Uzbekistan. I'd like to note that this was false and that citing the head of state can be done by the press service or other reliable sources. And with respect to the statements of rights being violated, there are procedures that are provided for in Uzbekistan. It would have been more effective to use these procedures. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Serbia.
Thank you. Serbia would like to exercise its right of reply to a statement made by organization Jednakost. The Constitution of the Republic of Serbia states that members of national minorities may choose their national councils to exercise the right to self-government in the field of education, culture, information, and official use of language and script. National councils of national minorities are bodies representing national minorities as collectives and have an advisory role in state bodies in field of importance for the exercise of the rights of national minorities. In any case, that can't provoke segregation, but in contrary, the full integration. Concerning the allocation of funds, which was questioned, we need to underline that they are allocated proportionally to all national minorities regarding their number. Also, the realization of the rights of national minorities is monitored through the reporting on the activities envisaged in the action plan that I previously mentioned. The Office for Human and Minority Rights prepares quarterly reports based on documents it receives from more than 80 stakeholders, including ministries and other competent authorities, national councils of national minorities. Just two more words. Provincial institutions, higher education institutions, regulatory bodies, and etc. Thank you.
Thank you. The final right of reply is Canada.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Our position is clear and immutable. Canada does not and will not recognize the illegal annexation of Crimea and Sevastopol, nor do we recognize the illegal referendum referenced by the Russian Federation. For those speakers encouraging visits to Crimea, we believe a good start would be the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, whose reports consistently note a lack of access to the peninsula, as well as the grave human rights violations that have taken place under the Russian occupation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we're going to end this session by thanking the interpreters for their hard work and for staying extra time, and to our expert speakers, Dr. Petra Rotter and Professor Fernand de Varenne. Thank you, and hope you all have a nice lunch.